The morning sun cast long shadows across the fertile fields of Clearwater, Montana. Sarah Mitchell stood on her porch, weathered hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee as her eyes swept across the land that had been her home for nearly 3 decades. At 58, her face bore the marks of a hard but dignified life. Deep lines etched around eyes that had witnessed both profound joy and devastating loss. The year was 1878. 7 years had passed since she buried her husband, Captain Thomas Mitchell. 7 years of solitude of quiet mornings like this one where the vast Montana sky seemed to echo the emptiness within her heart. She took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp autumn air. Another day, she whispered to herself, a ritual that had sustained her through countless mornings of grief and remembrance. Sarah's gaze drifted to the distant mountains, their peaks already capped with early snow. Thomas had loved those mountains, had claimed they reminded him of what mankind should aspire to be, steadfast, enduring, reaching ever upward. That was before the war, before the experiments, before the nightmares that would wake him screaming in the dark. A cloud passed over the sun, momentarily casting the farm in shadow. Sarah shivered not from the chill, but from the unsettling feeling that had been growing within her for weeks. A sense of foreboding, as if the peace she had carved out of grief was merely an illusion, a calm before an inevitable storm. The distant sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Sarah shaded her eyes, anxiety fluttering in her chest, until she recognized the rider's posture. A smile, rare and genuine, softened her features. "William," she breathed, setting down her coffee cup and straightening her apron. Her son rode tall in the saddle, his military bearing unmistakable, even from a distance. As he approached, Sarah could see the years hadn't been kind to him either. At 35, William Mitchell's face was gaunt, his eyes haunted by memories of combat that had followed him from the battlefields of the Civil War to the unforgiving streets of Chicago. "Mother," he called, dismounting with fluid grace that belied his inner turmoil. He removed his hat, revealing hair already graying at the temples. "It's good to see you." Sarah embraced her son, feeling the tension in his body, the way he held himself, as if constantly prepared for an attack. "You're early," she said, pulling back to study his face. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." William's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I thought it best to arrive ahead of the others, to prepare." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. William had always been the protector, even as a child. Now, with Elizabeth and young Benjamin due to arrive tomorrow, his instincts had clearly compelled him to secure the homestead first. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you could use a proper meal." The farmhouse kitchen was warm and inviting, filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering stew. As Sarah ladled the rich broth into a bowl, William removed his coat, revealing a holstered revolver at his hip. "Still expecting trouble wherever you go?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the weapon. William's expression darkened. "The world hasn't got in any kinder mother." Sarah placed the bowl before him. "And Chicago? Was it as bad as your letter suggested?" William stared into the steaming stew, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Worse. The banks, they have no mercy, no conscience. When the panic hit last year," he trailed off, shaking his head, "everything I built gone in a week." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're home now. That's what matters." William looked up, something vulnerable and almost childlike in his expression. "Is it still home after everything?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching wheels drew their attention. They exchanged puzzled glances. Elizabeth wasn't due until tomorrow. William was on his feet in an instant, hand moving to his revolver as he strode to the window. His posture relaxed slightly as he peered out. "It's Sheriff Wilson?" Sarah frowned. Frank Wilson rarely ventured out to the Mitchell farm without cause. The aging lawman had been a friend to Thomas, one of the few who hadn't shunned him when rumors of his wartime activities began to circulate. William opened the door before Wilson could knock. The sheriff removed his hat, nodding respectfully to both of them. His weathered face was grave, his normally friendly eyes troubled. "Sarah, William, sorry to intrude." "You're welcome any time, Frank," Sarah said, though her voice carried a note of apprehension. "What brings you all the way out here?" Wilson stepped inside, declining Sarah's offer of coffee with a small wave. "There's a stranger in town, calls himself Silas Maddox, claims to be an investor looking to buy land." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's been asking about you, Sarah, about the farm, about Thomas." The room seemed to grow colder at the mention of her late husband's name. Sarah's hand tightened on the back of a chair. What does he want to know? Everything, Wilson said grimly. Where Thomas served during the war. What projects he worked on. Whether he left anything behind. William stepped forward, his voice hard. And what did you tell him? Wilson met William's challenging gaze steadily. Nothing he couldn't learn elsewhere. That Thomas was a captain in the Union Army. That he worked on special projects. That he died in an accident 7 years ago. He turned back to Sarah. But he didn't believe me about that last part. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? He smiled when I mentioned the accident, like he knew something I didn't. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Sarah, this man, there's something wrong about him. He speaks like a gentleman, dresses like a wealthy businessman, but his eyes... The sheriff shook his head. I've seen those eyes before, on the battlefield. William's jaw tightened. You think he's dangerous? It wasn't a question, but Wilson nodded anyway. I think you should all be careful. Lock your doors at night. Keep your rifles loaded. After the sheriff departed, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen. William paced the room as dinner forgotten, while Sarah sat motionless at the table, her mind racing with half-formed suspicions and old fears. He's looking for Project Aegis, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. William stopped pacing, his expression grim. You don't know that. Don't I? Sarah stood, moving to the window to watch Wilson's wagon disappear down the long drive. A stranger asking about your father's work, specifically what he might have left behind. What else could it be? William ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it made Sarah's heart ache. Project Aegis was classified. Most people who knew about it are dead. Most, Sarah repeated, turning to face her son, but not all. The weight of unspoken history hung between them. William had served in the same war as his father, though in a different regiment. He had heard the whispers, the rumors about the experimental weapons developed by Captain Thomas Mitchell and his team weapons that harnessed energy in ways that defied conventional understanding of science. Weapons that, if the rumors were to be believed, had the potential to change the course of warfare forever. Sarah crossed the room to the large hearth that dominated one wall of the kitchen. With practiced movements, she removed a loose brick, revealing a small compartment. From it, she withdrew a slim leather journal bound with a thin metal clasp. Your father's notes, she said, holding the journal out to William. Not everything. He destroyed most of his research before we left Washington, but enough to understand what he created, what he came to fear. William stared at the journal as if it might bite him. You told me you burned it. I told you what you needed to believe, Sarah replied evenly, in case anyone ever came asking. William took the journal with reluctant hands. And now someone has. Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. Which is why you need to know the truth. All of it. Before Elizabeth and Benjamin arrive. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson. But neither Sarah nor William noticed the beauty. William opened the journal, his father's precise handwriting filling the pages with formulas, diagrams, and observations, the remnants of a brilliant mind haunted by the consequences of its own creation. As darkness fell, Sarah lit the oil lamps, their warm glow creating islands of light in the growing shadows. William read in silence, occasionally asking questions that Sarah answered in hushed tones as if afraid of being overheard despite the miles of empty land surrounding them. When William finally closed the journal, his face was ashen. He struggled to find words, beyond anything I imagined. The applications, the power, the danger, Sarah finished for him. Why your father walked away. Why he brought us here to the middle of nowhere. William's eyes met hers, filled with a new understanding. He didn't just walk away. He took it with him. Sarah nodded slowly. Not all of it, just the key components, the parts that would ensure no one could replicate his work. She moved to the window again, aiding out at the dark silhouette of the barn against the night sky. He built a chamber beneath the barn, reinforced with steel, protected by mechanisms only he understood. And now someone named Silas Maddox is looking for it, William said grimly. So it would seem. William stood, placing the journal on the table with careful reverence. We should leave. Take Elizabeth and Benjamin when they arrive tomorrow and go somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Sarah turned, her expression hardening. This was supposed to be somewhere safe, William. Your father chose this place carefully. Remote. Defensible. We can't just abandon it. Mother, No, Sarah cut him off, her voice taking on a steely quality that brooked no argument. This is our home. Your father's legacy is buried beneath our feet. I won't run from it. William studied his mother's face, recognizing the stubborn determination that had sustained her through unimaginable hardship. Finally, he nodded. Then we prepare for whatever or whoever is coming. That night, sleep eluded Sarah. She lay in her bed listening to the familiar creaks and groans of the old farmhouse sounds that had once been comforting, but now seemed ominous. In the room across the hall, she could hear William's restless movements, evidence that he too found no solace in slumber. Her mind replayed memories of Thomas, not the haunted man who had returned from war, but the brilliant, passionate engineer she had fallen in love with. The man who had once believed his work would save lives, only to discover the terrible truth that any technology powerful enough to protect was also powerful enough to destroy. Dawn broke with a tentative pale light that did little to dispel the sense of foreboding that had settled over the Mitchell farm. Sarah rose early, preparing a hearty breakfast that neither she nor William had much appetite for. They ate in silence, the weight of yesterday's revelations and the uncertainty of what lay ahead heavy between them. The sound of an approaching wagon around mid-morning brought both of them to their feet. William's hand moved instinctively to his revolver, but Sarah's face brightened with genuine joy. "Elizabeth," she said, already moving toward the door. The wagon that pulled into the yard carried Sarah's daughter, Elizabeth Lizzie Cooper, and her 10-year-old son, Benjamin. At 32, Elizabeth was a striking woman. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her movements efficient and purposeful as she set the brake and jumped down from the driver's seat. Sarah embraced her daughter fiercely, then turned to her grandson, who approached with more caution, his intelligent eyes taking in the farm with evident curiosity. "My goodness, Benjamin," Sarah exclaimed, "you've grown a foot since I last saw you." The boy smiled shyly. 7.5 inches, actually, grandmother. I've been measuring. Sarah laughed, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Of course you have." William helped unload the wagon, carrying trunks and bags into the house while Elizabeth and Benjamin settled in. As the family gathered in the kitchen for lunch, Sarah was struck by how right it felt to have them all together again, despite the circumstances that had precipitated the reunion. Elizabeth had written months ago about her struggles since her husband's death 3 years prior. The small savings James Cooper had left behind had dwindled, and Elizabeth's work as a nurse skills she had acquired serving in field hospitals during the war barely provided enough to support herself and Benjamin. When Sarah had invited them to move to the farm permanently, Elizabeth had accepted with barely concealed relief. Now watching her daughter efficiently butter bread while simultaneously answering Benjamin's endless questions about the local flora and fauna, Sarah felt a renewed determination to protect what remained of her family. After lunch, while Benjamin explored the farmyard under William's watchful eye, Sarah drew Elizabeth aside. The two women sat at the kitchen table, cups of tea cooling before them as Sarah revealed the truth about Thomas's work and the potential threat posed by Silas Maddox. Elizabeth listened with growing alarm, her practical nature immediately grasping the implications. "We should contact the authorities," she said when Sarah had finished. Sarah shook her head. "Your father's work was classified, Lizzie. If we draw attention to it, we risk more than just Maddox coming for it. The government might decide to reclaim what they believe is rightfully theirs." "But surely they would protect us," Elizabeth protested. "Perhaps," Sarah conceded. "Or perhaps they would simply take what they want and leave us to fend for ourselves. Your father didn't trust them, not after what happened." She reached across the table, taking Elizabeth's hand. "We need to handle this ourselves, quietly." Elizabeth squeezed her mother's hand, her expression troubled, but resolute. "Then we will. Benjamin and I didn't come all this way to lose another home." That evening, as the sun once again painted the sky in brilliant hues, the Mitchell family gathered on the porch. Benjamin peppered William with questions about his military service, while Elizabeth mended a tear in one of her son's shirts. Sarah sat slightly apart, rocking gently in Thomas's old chair, watching her family with a mixture of love and trepidation. The peaceful tableau was shattered by the sudden appearance of a column of smoke rising from the direction of their nearest neighbors, the Henderson farm, 3 miles to the east. William was the first to notice, standing abruptly, his hand moving to his revolver. "Fire," he said tersely. Elizabeth gathered Benjamin close instinctively, shielding him as Sarah rose to stand beside her son. The smoke was thick and black, too substantial to be a controlled burn or a cooking fire gone awry. "Something's wrong," Sarah murmured, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. William was already moving toward the barn. I'll saddle a horse and ride over. See if they need help. No, Sarah said sharply, causing William to pause. We stay together. All of us. Before William could argue, the sound of multiple horses approaching from the west, the direction of town, caught their attention. Sarah felt her heart race as a group of riders emerged from the tree line at the edge of their property. 5 men on horseback, led by a figure in a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Even at a distance, there was something commanding about his posture, an air of authority that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Inside, William ordered, his voice low and urgent. Now. Elizabeth ushered Benjamin through the door while Sarah hesitated, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Mother, William urged, taking her arm. Sarah allowed herself to be guided into the house, but her mind was racing. This was happening too quickly. They weren't prepared. The weapons were locked in the cabinet in Thomas's study. The barn with its secret underground chamber was now between them and the approaching men. William closed and barred the door, then moved swiftly to the gun cabinet. He unlocked it, removing his father's Winchester rifle and loading it with practiced efficiency before handing Sarah a revolver. Stay away from the windows, he instructed. Elizabeth, take Benjamin to the root cellar. There's a trap door in the pantry. Elizabeth nodded, her face pale but composed as she guided her son toward the back of the house. Benjamin's eyes were wide with fear, but he moved without protest, sensing the gravity of the situation. Sarah positioned herself by the front window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain, as she peered out at the riders who had now reached the yard. They spread out in a semicircle facing the house with an unmistakable tactical precision that spoke of military training. The leader, the man in the black coat, dismounted with fluid grace. He removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. He surveyed the farmhouse with a predatory interest that made Sarah's blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. I believe we have mutual interest to discuss. My name is Silas Maddox. William moved to stand beside Sarah, his rifle at the ready. What do we do? He whispered. Sarah studied Maddox, noting the way his men deferred to him, the confident set of his shoulders. This was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted by negotiation or by force. We talk, she decided. Buy time. William looked as if he wanted to object, but he nodded tersely. I'll cover you from the window. Sarah moved to the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself before unbarring it and stepping onto the porch. She kept the revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt, her chin high as she faced Maddox. This is private property, Mr. Maddox, she called, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. State your business or leave. Maddox smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. Direct and to the point. I appreciate that in a woman, Mrs. Mitchell. My business is simple. I'm interested in acquiring your land. It's not for sale. Maddox spread his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Everything has a price, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm prepared to be quite generous. Sarah's grip tightened on the concealed revolver. As I said, the land is not for sale. Now I must ask you to leave. Maddox's smile faded, his expression hardening. I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, I know what your husband left buried beneath this farm, Mrs. Mitchell. Project Aegis, a weapon of immense power decades ahead of its time. Sarah felt a cold weight settle in her chest, but she maintained her composure. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do. Maddox took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Captain Thomas Mitchell, brilliant engineer and scientist, appointed by President Lincoln himself to head a secret weapons program during the war. A program that developed energy-based weapons capable of changing the course of history. Sarah remained silent, her mind racing. How much did he know? How had he discovered the project's existence? Maddox continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Did your husband tell you how he tested his creation, Mrs. Mitchell? Did he share the details of what happened at Sharpsburg? A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Thomas had never spoken of Sharpsburg, not directly, but she had heard him cry out the name in his nightmares, had seen the horror in his eyes when he woke. Thomas left that life behind, she said firmly. Whatever you think is here, you're mistaken. Maddox's laugh was cold and mirthless. A convenient fiction. One I might have believed it if not for the energy readings my experts detected emanating from this very property. His eyes narrowed. The technology is here, Mrs. Mitchell, and one way or another, I will have it. Before Sarah could respond, a distant explosion shattered the tension. All heads turned toward the Henderson farm where flames were now clearly visible against the darkening sky. What have you done? Sarah demanded, horror dawning as she realized the implications. Maddox's expression remained impassive, a demonstration of my resolve. The Hendersons refused to sell just as you are refusing now. Their stubbornness has cost them everything. You monster, Sarah breathed, raising the revolver and aiming it squarely at Maddox's chest. There were children in that house. Maddox didn't flinch, his cold eyes assessing her with clinical detachment. And there are children in yours, Mrs. Mitchell. Your grandson Benjamin, I believe, such a bright boy according to his school records. The threat hung in the air between them, clear and chilling. Sarah's hand trembled slightly, but her aim remained true. You won't touch him, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Maddox smiled again, the expression devoid of warmth. That, my dear lady, is entirely up to you. He glanced at his men, who had their hands resting on their weapons ready to draw at his signal. I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you until tomorrow at noon to reconsider my offer. After that, he shrugged eloquently. Without waiting for a response, Maddox replaced his hat, tipping the brim slightly in a mockery of gentlemanly courtesy before mounting his horse. Until tomorrow, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah watched in silent fury as Maddox and his men rode away, their figures silhouetted against the fiery backdrop of the Henderson farm. Only when they had disappeared from sight did she lower the revolver, her hand shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. William emerged from the house, his rifle still at the ready, as he scanned the horizon for any sign of the riders returning. You heard, he asked grimly. Sarah nodded, her eyes still fixed on the distant flames. I heard. He knows too much, William said. About the project, about us. Sarah turned to her son, her expression hardening into resolve. Yes, which means we have until noon tomorrow to prepare for war. Inside the house, Elizabeth had emerged from the root cellar with Benjamin, who was pale and quiet, clutching his mother's hand with unusual tightness. Sarah knelt before her grandson, forcing a reassuring smile. It's going to be all right, Benjamin, she said, smoothing his hair. I promise. The boy nodded, but his eyes were knowing beyond his years. They're bad men, he said simply, like the ones who hurt father. Elizabeth exchanged a pained glance with Sarah. James Cooper had been killed by bandits while traveling for his work as a surveyor. Benjamin had been 7 at the time, old enough to understand death, but too young to comprehend its senseless cruelty. Yes, Sarah agreed softly. They are bad men, but we're not going to let them hurt us. As night fell fully, the Mitchell family gathered in the kitchen, the curtains drawn tight against the darkness. A single oil lamp illuminated their faces as they discussed their options in hushed tones. We could try to flee tonight, Elizabeth suggested, her practical nature seeking the safest route. Take what we can carry and head for the mountains. William shook his head. They'll be watching the roads, and even if we made it out, they'd just follow us. He glanced at Sarah. As long as they believe the technology is here, they won't stop hunting us. Sarah's hands were wrapped around a cup of cold tea, her eyes distant as she considered their limited choices. We fight, she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. We defend our home. Elizabeth looked skeptical. Against 5 armed men, possibly more. 7, Benjamin corrected softly. There were 2 more waiting in the trees. I counted. The adults exchanged surprised glances, William nodding with grudging approval at his nephew's observation skills. 7 then, Sarah acknowledged, against the 4 of us. 3, Elizabeth corrected, her expression troubled. Benjamin is a child mother. He can't be part of this. Benjamin straightened in his chair. I can help. I'm good at science. Grandfather's journal. No, all 3 adults said in unison, causing Benjamin to shrink back slightly. Sarah softened her tone, reaching out to squeeze her grandson's hand. Your mother is right, Benjamin. This isn't your fight. The boy looked as if he wanted to argue but remained silent, his young face set in a stubborn expression that reminded Sarah painfully of Thomas. William stood pacing the kitchen with restless energy. We need a plan, a way to use our knowledge of the land to our advantage. Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. The barn, the underground chamber. If they want Project Aegis so badly, perhaps we should give it to them. Elizabeth's eyes widened. Mother, you can't be serious. Father's technology could be our only chance, Sarah finished firmly. She stood moving to retrieve Thomas's journal from where William had left it earlier. We have until noon tomorrow. That gives us, she glanced at the clock on the mantel, 14 hours to prepare a reception for Mr. Maddox and his men. As Sarah opened the journal, her fingertips tracing the familiar handwriting, a distant memory surfaced at Thomas's voice, soft and haunted in the dark of night. I created Aegis to protect, to shield from harm, but in the wrong hands. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, sending a silent apology to her late husband for what she was about to do. Then she opened them, her resolve hardening as she looked at the faces of her family, William bearing the scars of war both visible and hidden, Elizabeth, who had lost so much yet remained strong, and Benjamin, innocent yet already touched by tragedy. Thomas designed Aegis as a shield, she said quietly, but every shield can also be a weapon. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the acrid scent of smoke from the Henderson farm, a reminder of what awaited them if they failed. Sarah turned the pages of the journal until she found what she was looking for. Diagrams and formulas that detailed the heart of Project Aegis, the energy core that had been Thomas's greatest achievement and his deepest regret. William, Elizabeth, she said, her voice taking on a tone of command that neither of her children had heard before. It's time I showed you what your father really created. As she led them toward the barn, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, the dread of what tomorrow might bring, but beneath it was something else, a fierce determination to protect what remained of her family at any cost. The barn door creaked as William pulled it open, revealing the familiar interior stalls for the horses, stacks of hay farm implements hanging on the walls. But Sarah moved purposefully toward the back to a seemingly ordinary section of the plank floor. Help me with this, she instructed, bending to grasp an iron ring partially hidden beneath a loose board. William and Elizabeth joined her, and together they lifted a trap door, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. Sarah lit a lantern, the flame casting long shadows as she led the way down each step, taking them deeper into Thomas Mitchell's secret legacy. At the bottom of the stairs was a steel door, its surface unmarked, except for a small, peculiar lock mechanism. Sarah withdrew key from her pocket, one she had worn on a chain around her neck for 7 years, hidden beneath her clothing like a shameful secret. Thomas made me promise, she said softly, that I would never open this door unless our lives depended on it. She looked at her children, her expression grave. I believe that time has come. And the key turned with surprising ease, the mechanism within the door clicking and whirring before it swung open, revealing a chamber that seemed utterly out of place beneath a Montana farm. Smooth metal walls reflected the lantern light, illuminating workbenches covered in equipment decades ahead of its time. Glass tubes filled with glowing substances, coils of copper wire, and devices whose purpose defied immediate understanding. At the center of the room stood a cylindrical structure, approximately the size of a man, its surface inscribed with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. Project Aegis, Sarah said simply, gesturing to the cylinder. Or rather, its heart. William circled the device, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. This is what Maddox wants, this machine? Sarah nodded. Not just the machine, but the principles behind it. The knowledge of how to harness energy in ways that conventional science considers impossible. Elizabeth approached more cautiously, her medical training making her wary of the unknown. What does it do exactly? Sarah moved to one of the workbenches, revealing a smaller version of the cylinder, a prototype barely the size of her forearm. It converts energy from one form to another. It can absorb immense amounts of force, heat, kinetic energy, even light, and redirect it. A shield, William murmured, understanding dawning. Yes, Sarah confirmed. A perfect defense in theory, but your father discovered that it could also be used offensively, that the stored energy could be released as a weapon of devastating power. She picked up the prototype, handling it with a reverence born of both respect and fear. This is what Maddox wants, the power to destroy, to control through fear. She set the prototype down carefully, and we're going to give it to him. Elizabeth and William exchanged alarmed glances. Mother, Elizabeth began, you can't be serious. If this technology is as powerful as you say, I don't intend to let him leave with it, Sarah interrupted, her voice hard. But we need to draw him in, make him believe he's won. She looked around the chamber, her gaze calculating. And then we'll show him exactly what Project Aegis can do when it's used to protect rather than destroy. As Sarah outlined her plan, William and Elizabeth listened with growing understanding. It was dangerous, fraught with risk, but it offered a chance, perhaps their only chance against Maddox and his men. When they finally emerged from the underground chamber hours later, the night was deep and silent. The distant flames of the Henderson farm reduced to a dull glow on the horizon. Benjamin had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, his head resting on his arms, his face peaceful in slumber. Elizabeth gently lifted her son, carrying him to the small bedroom that had been prepared for him. Sarah watched them go, a lump forming in her throat as she considered what tomorrow might bring. William placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying. "It will work," he said quietly. "It has to." Sarah nodded, though doubt gnawed at her resolve. "Get some rest," she told her son. "Dawn will come soon enough." But even as William retired to his room, Sarah knew sleep would elude her. Instead, she settled into Thomas's chair by the fire, the journal open in her lap as she reviewed the details of their plan one last time. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking the passage of hours as Sarah sat motionless, lost in thoughts of the past and the uncertain future. Memories of Thomas, his brilliant mind, his gentle hands, the way his eyes would light up when he spoke of his work before the war, cast its shadow over him. "I hope you can forgive me," she whispered to the empty room, her fingers tracing a diagram in the journal, "for using your creation this way." As the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, Sarah closed the journal and rose from the chair, her decision made. Their plan was set. By noon, they would confront Silas Maddox and his men, using Thomas's technology against those who sought to exploit it. What happened after that would be in God's hands. Sarah moved to the window, watching as the sun breached the horizon, painting the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber. A new day was beginning, perhaps their last day on this farm that had been their sanctuary for so long. She squared her shoulders, drawing strength from the memory of Thomas and from the knowledge that within hours, one way or another, this threat to her family would end. Sarah Mitchell had buried her husband 7 years ago. She had endured grief, loneliness, and hardship. She had kept his secrets and protected his legacy. Now she would fight for the future. He had died trying to secure a future where the terrible power he had unleashed would never again be used to harm. As the sunlight flooded the kitchen, Sarah began preparing breakfast, the simple routine grounding her in the present moment, pushing back the fear of what lay ahead. One last meal together as a family before they faced whatever fate awaited them. William joined her first, his face grim but determined as he helped set the table. Elizabeth appeared soon after with Benjamin trailing behind her, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but brightening as he smelled the pancakes cooking on the stove. They ate in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the coming confrontation hanging over them like a storm cloud. Only Benjamin seemed oblivious to the tension, chattering about a book he'd been reading, his innocent enthusiasm, a painful reminder of what was at stake. After breakfast, they moved with purpose, each attending to their assigned tasks. William checked and loaded weapons, positioning them strategically throughout the house. Elizabeth prepared medical supplies, her nursing experience guiding her as she organized bandages and medicines with efficient precision. Sarah and Benjamin worked together in the kitchen, the boy following his grandmother's instructions carefully as they mixed various household chemicals in precise measurements. Sarah was reluctant to involve her grandson, but Benjamin's knowledge of basic chemistry gleaned from books and his natural aptitude for science made him an invaluable assistant. "Is this right, grandmother?" Benjamin asked, holding up a jar of clear liquid. Sarah examined it critically before nodding. "Perfect. Now remember, this is very dangerous. You're only to handle it when I tell you, understood?" Benjamin nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am." As the morning progressed, Sarah felt a strange calm descend upon her. The plan was in place. The preparations were as complete as they could be given the limited time. Now all that remained was to wait for noon and the return of Silas Maddox. At 11:30, the family gathered on the porch. William stood at Sarah's right, his Winchester rifle held with casual competence. Elizabeth was at her left, outwardly calm, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. Benjamin had been instructed to remain in the root cellar safe beneath the house, but Sarah knew her curious grandson well enough to suspect he might not stay put once the confrontation began. "Remember," Sarah said quietly, "we need to draw them toward the barn. Make Maddox believe he's getting what he wants." William and Elizabeth nodded, their faces set with determination. The plan was dangerous, balanced on a knife edge of timing and deception, but it was their best hope against superior numbers. At precisely noon, the riders appeared on the horizon, their approach deliberate and unhurried. Silas Maddox led them, his black coat and hat making him stand out against the dusty landscape. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Beside her, William tensed his finger, resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. "Easy," Sarah murmured. "Not yet." Maddox and his men drew up in the yard, spreading out in the same tactical formation as before. 7 men, just as Benjamin had counted, each armed, each watching the farmhouse with predatory intensity. Maddox dismounted, removing his hat with a flourish that might have seemed courteous in another context. "Mrs. Mitchell," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I trust you have had time to reconsider my offer?" Sarah stepped forward, her chin high, her eyes fixed on Maddox's face. "I have, Mr. Maddox." A smile spread across Maddox's features, triumphant and cold. "Excellent. Then you'll show me to the technology first," Sarah said firmly. "I want your word that my family will be unharmed. That once you have what you came for, you'll leave us in peace." Maddox spread his hands wide in a gesture of apparent sincerity. "You have my word as a gentleman, Mrs. Mitchell. Show me Project Aegis and you'll never see me or my men again." The lie was so transparent that Sarah almost laughed. Instead, she nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Very well, follow me." As Sarah led Maddox toward the barn, William and Elizabeth fell in behind them, maintaining a cautious distance. Maddox's men remained mounted, watching the proceedings with alert eyes, hands never straying far from their weapons. The barn door creaked as Sarah pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Maddox followed her inside, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as he glanced around with barely concealed eagerness. "Where is it?" he demanded, his pretense of courtesy beginning to slip. Sarah moved toward the back of the barn to the trap door concealed beneath loose planks. "Under here," she said, bending to grasp the iron ring. "Will you help me lift it?" Maddox's eyes gleamed with anticipation as he moved to assist, unaware of William positioning himself near the barn door, or of Elizabeth slipping quietly around the side of the building to complete her part of the plan. Together, Sarah and Maddox lifted the trap door, revealing the narrow staircase descending into darkness. Sarah lit a lantern, the flame casting long shadows as she led the way down, feeling Maddox's presence at her back like a physical weight. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused before the steel door, withdrawing the key from around her neck. "Before we go further," she said, turning to face Maddox, "I need to know. How did you learn about Project Aegis?" "It was classified, the records destroyed." Maddox smiled, a cold, triumphant expression that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Not all records, Mrs. Mitchell, and not all of your husband's colleagues were as principled as he was." His smile faded, replaced by a hard glint in his eyes. "Some were quite willing to share what they knew, given the right incentives." Sarah's hand tightened around the key. "You tortured them." "A crude term," Maddox said dismissively. "I prefer to think of it as aggressive negotiation, but effective nonetheless." His expression darkened. "Though your husband's chief assistant, Dr. Harrison, proved particularly resilient, it took 3 days before he finally revealed the location of the prototype." Sarah felt a surge of grief for James Harrison, who had been Thomas's closest friend and colleague. Thomas had spoken of him often, always with respect and affection. To imagine him suffering at Maddox's hands. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her. "Why are you so determined to possess this technology?" Maddox's eyes took on a fanatical gleam. "Power, Mrs. Mitchell. The kind of power that reshapes nations. The kind that ensures those who wield it never again suffer defeat or humiliation." His voice hardened. "The kind that would have changed the outcome of the war had it been deployed properly." Understanding dawned. "You fought for the Confederacy." "I commanded the 18th Virginia Regiment," Maddox said, drawing himself up with military bearing. "I watched my men die by the hundreds, outgunned and outmanned by Northern forces equipped with superior weaponry." His expression twisted with old hatred. "Weapons that your husband helped develop." Sarah's mind raced. The 18th Virginia had fought at Antietam, known as Sharpsburg, to the Confederate forces, the battle Thomas had cried out about in his nightmares. "You were there," she breathed. "At Sharpsburg, Charles, when Thomas tested the prototype." Maddox's eyes narrowed. "Yes, I saw what your husband's creation could do." The blinding light, the energy that cut through our lines like they were paper. His voice dropped to a whisper. I watched half my regiment disintegrate before my eyes. Horror swept through Sarah. Thomas had never spoken of the test, had never described the full destructive potential of his creation. But she had seen the haunted look in his eyes, had held him through countless nightmares. And now, Maddox continued, his voice regaining its strength. I will possess that power. The South may have lost the war, but with Project Aegis, we can still win the peace. He gestured impatiently toward the door. Open it. Sarah hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she inserted the key into the lock. This was the moment upon which their entire plan hinged. Once this door opened, there would be no turning back. She thought of Benjamin, hopefully safe in the root cellar, of Elizabeth and William risking their lives to execute their parts of the plan, of Thomas and the terrible burden he had carried to his grave. With a silent prayer, Sarah turned the key. The mechanism within the door clicked and whirred, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. Then with a soft hiss, the door swung open, revealing the chamber beyond the secret heart of Project Aegis. Maddox pushed past Sarah, his eagerness overriding any remaining pretense of courtesy as he entered the chamber. His eyes widened at the sight of the equipment, the glowing tubes, the intricate diagrams covering the walls. But it was the cylindrical device at the center of the room that held his attention. The prototype of Project Aegis, or rather what appeared to be the prototype. Magnificent, Maddox breathed, approaching the cylinder with reverent steps. After all these years, Sarah remained by the door watching as Maddox circled the device, his fingers hovering above its surface, but not quite touching, as if afraid it might disappear at his contact. How does it work? He demanded, turning to Sarah with feverish intensity. How do I activate it? Sarah stepped forward, moving to one of the workbenches where various tools and smaller devices were arranged. It's not that simple, she said, carefully selecting a small, spherical object. The system requires calibration before it can be transported. Maddox watched her every move with suspicious eyes. Explain. Sarah held up the sphere, which pulsed with a faint blue light. This is the activation core. It needs to be inserted into the main cylinder and calibrated to the specific energy frequency you wish to harness. She moved toward the cylinder, the sphere cradled in her palms. The process takes approximately 5 minutes. Maddox nodded impatiently. Proceed. Sarah positioned herself at the cylinder, her back to Maddox, as she pretended to make adjustments to the device. In reality, she was watching the small mirror she had affixed to the workbench earlier, a mirror that allowed her to see the door without turning around. Any moment now, if William and Elizabeth had succeeded in their tasks, the signal would come. Hurry! Maddox urged, his voice tight with anticipation. Sarah made a show of inserting the sphere into an opening in the cylinder's surface. The calibration is delicate, she said, her hands moving in complex patterns over the device's controls. Rush it, and the entire system could destabilize. Maddox paced behind her, his patience visibly wearing thin. You have 2 minutes, Mrs. Mitchell. Then we're leaving, with or without your calibration. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the mirror, her heart racing as she continued her pretense of adjusting the device. Where was the signal? Had something gone wrong? And then she saw it, a flash of light. 3 quick pulses reflected in the mirror. William and Elizabeth had succeeded. The trap was set. It's ready, Sarah announced, stepping back from the cylinder. Maddox moved forward eagerly, his hands reaching for the device. At last. But before you take it, Sarah said, her voice taking on a new tone that caused Maddox to pause. There's something you should know about Project Aegis. Maddox turned to her, suspicion narrowing his eyes. What? Sarah met his gaze steadily. My husband didn't abandon his work because he feared its power, Maddox. He abandoned it because he couldn't control it. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Maddox's face. What are you talking about? The energy core is unstable, Sarah said, backing slowly toward the door. Always has been. That's why the test at Sharpsburg went so terribly wrong. Not because the weapon worked too well, but because it couldn't be contained. Understanding dawned on Maddox's face, quickly replaced by fury. You're lying, he snarled, reaching for his revolver. Sarah smiled grimly. Am I? Then perhaps you'd like to explain why that device is currently about 30 seconds away from releasing enough energy to vaporize this entire chamber. Maddox's eyes darted to the cylinder where the small sphere Sarah had inserted was now pulsing with an increasingly bright blue light, the intervals between pulses growing shorter. What have you done? he demanded, his voice rising with panic. Sarah reached the door, her hand finding the handle. Honored my husband's legacy, she said simply, ensuring his creation is never used to harm again. With that, she stepped through the doorway, pulling the heavy steel door closed behind her. The lock engaged automatically, sealing Maddox inside with the device. Sarah raced up the stairs, emerging into the barn, just as the first tremors began to shake the ground beneath her feet. William was waiting, grabbing her arm to steady her as they ran toward the farmhouse. Elizabeth! Sarah gasped as they sprinted across the yard. Already inside with Benjamin, William confirmed. Behind them, Maddox's men were shouting in confusion, some drawing their weapons, while others turned their horses as if to flee. None of them seemed to understand the danger they were in. Sarah and William burst through the farmhouse door, William slamming it shut and barring it as Sarah rushed to the root cellar where Elizabeth and Benjamin waited. Now, Sarah called down to them. Elizabeth nodded, striking a match and lighting the fuse of the device they had constructed earlier, a collection of household chemicals and mining explosives that William had procured from a cache Thomas had maintained. The family huddled together in the root cellar, William pulling the trap door closed above them as the first explosion rocked the underground chamber beneath the barn. The sound was deafening even through the layers of earth and wood that shielded them. The ground shook violently, jars and tools cascading from shelves as dust rained down from the ceiling of their shelter. Benjamin clung to his mother, his face buried against her shoulder, as Elizabeth held him tight, whispering reassurances that were lost in the cacophony of destruction above. Sarah closed her eyes, sending a silent prayer heavenward for forgiveness, for protection, for the soul of her husband, whose creation was now fulfilling its final purpose. The series of explosions seemed to last an eternity, though in reality it was less than a minute before silence descended. A heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the four people huddled in the root cellar. William was the first to move cautiously, pushing open the trapdoor and peering out. "Stay here," he instructed, climbing up into the kitchen. Sarah followed, despite his warning, emerging into a kitchen that was miraculously intact, though dishes had been shaken from cupboards and furniture, overturned by the force of the explosion. Together, they moved to the front door, opening it to survey the damage. Where the barn had stood was now a smoking crater, the ground around it scorched and barren. Of Maddox and his men, there was no sign, only scattered debris and the remains of their horses killed instantly by the blast. "It worked," William said quietly, a mixture of relief and shock in his voice. Sarah nodded, unable to speak as she stared at the destruction. Thomas's legacy, the secret he had guarded so carefully, was gone, destroyed along with the man who had sought to use it for harm. Elizabeth emerged from the root cellar with Benjamin, the boy's eyes widening at the sight of the crater. "Is it over?" Elizabeth asked, her arm protectively around her son's shoulders. Sarah turned to her daughter, about to respond with a reassurance, when a movement at the edge of the property caught her eye. A figure staggering toward them from the direction of town. William raised his rifle, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "Wait," she said, squinting against the sun. "It's Sheriff Wilson." The lawman approached, his face pale and drawn, his uniform covered in dust. He stopped a few yards from the porch, surveying the destruction with undisguised horror. "What in God's name happened here?" he demanded. Sarah stepped forward, her expression grave. "Justice frank, nothing more, nothing less." Wilson shook his head, bewilderment clear in his eyes. "The entire town felt the explosion. People are saying it's the end of days." "Not the end," Sarah said quietly. "Just the end of a nightmare that's hung over this family for far too long." Wilson looked as if he wanted to press for more details, but something in Sarah's expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded slowly. "There'll be questions. Officials from the Capitol, most likely." "We'll answer them," Sarah assured him, "as best we can." As Wilson turned to leave, promising to return with help to clean up the debris, Sarah gathered her family close. They stood together on the porch, surveying what remained of their home. The farmhouse still standing, the fields undamaged, but the barn and its terrible secret reduced to ashes. "What do we do now?" Elizabeth asked softly. Sarah looked at each of them in turn. William bearing the weight of war and loss. Elizabeth strong despite her suffering. Benjamin innocent, yet resilient. Her family, survivors. "We rebuild," she said simply. "We move forward." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the scarred land, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the burden of secrecy and fear she had carried for 7 long years. Thomas's legacy was gone, his creation destroyed. But the most important part of him lived on in the family they had created together. In William's quiet strength, Elizabeth's compassionate heart, Benjamin's curious mind. That was the true legacy worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth surviving for. Sarah Mitchell looked out over the land that had been her home, changed now by violence, but still theirs. And for the first time in 7 years, she felt something like peace. The nightmare was over. The future, uncertain as it might be, belonged to them once more. 1 month had passed since the explosion that destroyed the barn, and with it, Silas Maddox. The crater had begun to heal, grass tentatively sprouting at its edges, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the scarred earth. The Mitchell family had settled into an uneasy peace, rebuilding what they could of their lives, while attempting to process the violence that had erupted in their once tranquil home. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching William repair the fence line that had been damaged in the blast. Her son had thrown himself into the physical labor of restoration, working from dawn until dusk, as if the exertion might somehow purge the memories of that terrible day. Elizabeth had resumed her role as the family's healer, tending not only to their lingering injuries, but also to those of neighbors who had been caught in the periphery of the explosion. Young Benjamin, however, worried Sarah the most. The boy had grown quieter in the aftermath, his natural curiosity seemingly dampened by the trauma he had witnessed. Where once he had peppered her with endless questions about science and nature, now he spent hours sitting silently on the porch, staring at the crater with an intensity that troubled her deeply. Sarah sighed, setting down the dish she had been drying. The official investigation had come and gone, Sheriff Wilson skillfully steering the authorities toward the conclusion that Maddox and his men had been transporting unstable mining explosives that had accidentally detonated. It was a plausible explanation, one that the territorial officials had readily accepted, eager to close the case and return to the capital. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal wasn't over. Something about Maddox's final words to her in the underground chamber nagged at her consciousness. He had spoken of the South winning the peace as if his actions were part of some larger strategy rather than mere personal vengeance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Sarah from her thoughts. She tensed instinctively, one hand moving to the revolver she now kept within reach at all times. Peering through the window, she relaxed slightly at the sight of Sheriff Wilson's familiar figure approaching on horseback. "William," she called out, "Sheriff Wilson's here." Her son straightened, setting aside his tools as he watched the lawman approach. His hands, Sarah noticed, had also moved to rest near his own sidearm. Some habits formed in war and reinforced by recent events were not easily abandoned. Wilson dismounted with a grunt, his weathered face grave as he tied his horse to the hitching post. Sarah met him on the porch, her attempt at a welcoming smile fading as she registered the tension in his bearing. "Frank," she greeted him, "what brings you out this way?" Wilson removed his hat, twisting it nervously in his hands. "Sarah, William." He nodded to her son who had joined them. "I'm afraid I've got troubling news." Sarah gestured toward the chairs on the porch. "Sit, please. You look like you could use some coffee." "No time for that," Wilson said, remaining standing. "There are men in town asking questions about Maddox, about what happened here." William stepped forward. "What kind of men?" "They claim to be Pinkerton agents," Wilson replied, his voice dropping. "Investigating the disappearance of several businessmen last seen heading this way." He looked pointedly at the crater where the barn had once stood. "But something's not right about them. They've got the badges, the credentials, but you don't believe them," Sarah finished for him. Wilson shook his head. "No, ma'am, I do not. They're too military, the way they stand, the way they talk. And they're not asking the kinds of questions Pinkertons would ask." He glanced around nervously. "They wanted to know specifics about the explosion, about the color of the flames, the sound it made, like they were looking for something particular." Sarah and William exchanged troubled glances. The explosion caused by Project Aegis had indeed been distinctive, a blinding blue-white flash followed by a concussive wave that had more in common with lightning than conventional explosives. "How many?" William asked, his voice hardening into the tone of a soldier assessing a threat. "4 that I've seen," Wilson answered, "but they mentioned associates who would be joining them shortly." Sarah's mind raced. If these men were connected to Maddox, if they knew about Project Aegis, then the family's brief respite was over. "How long do we have?" Wilson twisted his hat more vigorously. "That's why I rode out straight away." They were gathering supplies, but I'd say they'll be heading this way by morning. He hesitated, then added reluctantly, they've deputized a couple of local men to accompany them. Made it all official-like. Meaning if we resist them, we'd be breaking the law, William concluded grimly. Wilson nodded miserably. I tried to stand my ground, Sarah, I truly did. But they've got papers from the territorial governor himself. There wasn't much I could do except ride out here to warn you. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on the sheriff's arm. You've done right by us, Frank. We're grateful. She straightened a decision forming in her mind. We'll need to prepare. Prepare? Wilson looked alarmed. Sarah, these men have the law on their side, at least on paper. If you resist them, we won't resist, Sarah interrupted. We'll cooperate, answer their questions, show them the crater. Let them see there's nothing left to find. She met William's eyes, a silent message passing between them. But we'll be ready if their intentions prove unfriendly. Wilson looked unconvinced but nodded slowly. I'll do what I can to slow them down. Maybe create some confusion about which road leads out here. He replaced his hat, his expression troubled. But Sarah, if these men are who I suspect they are, they won't be as easily fooled as the territorial investigators. We understand, William said, offering his hand to the sheriff. Thank you, Frank. As Wilson rode away, Sarah turned to her son, the facade of calm confidence fading now that they were alone. Get Elizabeth, we need to talk. Within minutes, the family had gathered in the kitchen, Benjamin included despite Elizabeth's initial protest. Sarah had insisted that the boy was old enough to understand the danger they faced and that keeping him ignorant might put him at greater risk. We need to assume these men know about Project Aegis, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. They may even know more about it than Maddox did. Elizabeth, seated with Benjamin close at her side, frowned. But the prototype was destroyed in the explosion. There's nothing left for them to find. Sarah and William exchanged glances, a moment of silent communication that Elizabeth immediately noticed. What? She demanded. What aren't you telling me? Sarah sighed, reaching beneath her collar to withdraw a small key similar but not identical to the one she had used to open the chamber beneath the barn. The prototype wasn't the only thing your father built, she said quietly. William leaned forward, his voice dropping despite the fact that they were alone. The barn chamber contained a decoy, convincing enough to fool Maddox, but not the real Project Aegis. Elizabeth's eyes widened. You mean there's a second chamber, Sarah confirmed. Your father built it as a precaution in case the first was ever discovered. She looked at each of them in turn, her expression grave. What we destroyed was dangerous, yes, but it was only a fraction of the power of the true Aegis device. Benjamin, who had been listening intently, spoke up for the first time. Where is it, grandmother, the real one? Sarah hesitated, then made a decision. Under the house? Beneath the root cellar, hidden behind a false wall. Your grandfather designed it so that the entrance would only be visible if you knew exactly what to look for. And you think these men will look for it? Elizabeth stated, understanding dawning. I think we have to assume they will, Sarah replied, which means we need to be prepared to either protect it or, she paused, the words difficult to speak, destroy it completely. William stood pacing the kitchen with restless energy. We should pack essentials, be ready to leave if necessary. And go where? Elizabeth challenged. If these men are as dangerous as you believe, they'll hunt us wherever we flee. Your mother's right, Sarah said to William. Running isn't the answer. We need to face this here on ground, we know, with whatever advantages we can muster. For the next several hours, the family prepared as best they could. William checked and cleaned their limited arsenal of weapons, while Elizabeth gathered medical supplies and packed essential items in case evacuation became their only option. Sarah and Benjamin worked together to secure the house, boarding up vulnerable windows and ensuring all entrances except the front door were barricaded. As night fell, a somber mood settled over the household. They ate dinner in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the morning might bring. Benjamin, exhausted from the day's labor, fell asleep at the table, his head nodding forward onto his chest until Elizabeth gently roused him and led him to bed. Once the boy was settled, the adults reconvened in the kitchen, speaking in low voices to avoid waking him. If these men are connected to the government, Elizabeth reasoned, wouldn't it be better to simply tell them the truth? That father destroyed his own research, that nothing remains. Sarah shook her head. Your father didn't trust the government with Aegis, Lizzie, not after what happened at Sharpsburg. She stared into the flames flickering in the hearth. He saw firsthand what men will do with that kind of power. But surely after all this time, men like Maddox still exist, William interrupted grimly. Men who see weapons as the path to power rather than the last resort of the desperate. Sarah reached across the table, taking Elizabeth's hand. Your father gave his life to protect this secret. I won't dishonor his sacrifice by surrendering it now, not even to men with government badges. Elizabeth searched her mother's face, then nodded reluctantly. So we lie, pretend ignorance. We tell a version of the truth, Sarah corrected, that Maddox came looking for something he believed was here, that he threatened us, and that he died when his own explosives detonated accidentally. William leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. It might work, but we should be prepared for them to search the property regardless. Agreed, Sarah said, which is why I want you both to know how to access the real chamber, just in case. She didn't complete the thought, but the implication was clear. In case something happened to her. Sarah retrieved a piece of paper and began sketching a diagram of the root cellar, indicating the location of the hidden entrance and explaining the mechanism that would reveal it. William and Elizabeth listened intently, committing the details to memory before Sarah burned the drawing in the fireplace, the ashes carrying away one more secret into the night. As they prepared for bed, William paused at the door to his room. Mother, he said hesitantly, are you certain the second chamber is secure? That the explosion didn't damage it? Sarah nodded. Your father built it to withstand far worse. Triple reinforced walls separate ventilation system, completely isolated from the barn chamber. She offered a small, sad smile. He was nothing if not thorough in his precautions. William seemed about to say more, but simply nodded, bidding her good night before retiring to his room. Sarah remained in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the familiar creaks of the old farmhouse, settling for the night, wondering if it would be their last peaceful evening in the home they had fought so hard to protect. Sleep eluded Sarah that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with contingency plans and worst-case scenarios. The weight of responsibility she carried for her family, for Thomas's legacy, pressed down on her like a physical burden, making each breath a conscious effort. Near dawn, she finally drifted into a fitful slumber, only to be awakened what felt like moments later by William's urgent voice. Mother, he called, shaking her gently. They're coming. Sarah was instantly alert, rising from bed and moving to the window. In the distance, she could see a cloud of dust rising from the road, evidence of multiple riders approaching at a steady pace. How many? She asked, reaching for her clothes. At least 6, William replied, his face grim. 2 wagons as well. Sarah dressed quickly, her fingers working with practiced efficiency despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. Wake Elizabeth and Benjamin. Tell them to dress plainly, nothing that would suggest we're expecting trouble. As William strode from the room, Sarah reached beneath her mattress, retrieving the small revolver she kept there. She checked that it was loaded before tucking it into the pocket of her skirt, its weight both reassuring and ominous against her thigh. By the time the riders reached the property, the Mitchell family was assembled on the porch, presenting a picture of ordinary rural life disturbed by unexpected visitors. Sarah stood at the center, flanked by William and Elizabeth, with Benjamin partially shielded behind them. The group that approached was indeed military in bearing, despite their civilian clothes and Pinkerton badges. The leader, a tall man with iron-gray hair and calculating eyes, halted his horse a respectful distance from the porch. Mrs. Mitchell, he called, his voice carrying a note of authority that confirmed Wilson's suspicions. This was a man accustomed to command. I am Sarah Mitchell, she replied evenly. What brings Pinkerton agents to our doorstep so early in the morning? The man dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to one of his companions before approaching the porch. Colonel James Reynolds, ma'am, special investigator. He flashed a badge that Sarah had no way of verifying. I'm investigating the disappearance of several individuals last seen in this area approximately 1 month ago. Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral. Sheriff Wilson mentioned you were making inquiries in town. I'm afraid I don't know how we can help you. Reynolds' smile didn't reach his eyes. I believe you do, Mrs. Mitchell. A man named Silas Maddox and 6 associates visited your farm. They never returned to town. He gestured toward the crater where the barn had once stood. And I can't help but notice you've experienced some structural changes to your property. William stepped forward, his posture subtly shifting to place himself between Reynolds and his mother. Mr. Maddox threatened our family colonel. He was transporting explosives which detonated accidentally during the confrontation. We reported the incident to the proper authorities who conducted a thorough investigation. Reynolds studied William with the assessing gaze of one soldier evaluating another. Yes, I've reviewed their findings. Rather cursory, if you don't mind my saying. They failed to ask some rather important questions, such as, Elizabeth spoke up, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her shoulders. Reynolds turned his attention to her, his smile widening fractionally, such as why Silas Maddox, a former Confederate officer turned successful businessman, would have any interest in a remote Montana farm. His gaze shifted back to Sarah. Or why an explosion from conventional mining explosives would produce a distinctive blue-white flash visible from town, along with a concussive wave pattern inconsistent with any known chemical compound. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Reynolds knew far more than she had feared. I'm afraid I can't speak to the specifics of the explosion, Colonel. We were taking shelter in the root cellar when it occurred. Of course, Reynolds nodded, his tone suggesting he expected such an answer. Perhaps you wouldn't mind if my men and I had a look around. Purely routine, I assure you. Sarah hesitated, aware that refusing would only increase his suspicions. May I see your warrant, Colonel? Something flickered in Reynolds' eyes, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect. He reached into his coat, producing an official-looking document bearing the territorial seal. All in order, Mrs. Mitchell, signed by the governor himself. Sarah examined the warrant carefully, noting that it did indeed authorize a search of the property. With a resigned nod, she stepped aside. Very well, but I'd appreciate it if you'd respect our privacy and conduct your investigation with minimal disruption to our home. Naturally, Reynolds agreed, signaling to his men. They dismounted as one moving with the synchronized precision of a military unit rather than civilian investigators. For the next several hours, Reynolds and his men methodically searched the property. They examined the crater with scientific instruments that Sarah had never seen before, collecting soil samples and taking measurements. They searched the house with equal thoroughness, though they were careful not to damage anything in the process. Sarah watched them with growing unease. These were not ordinary lawmen, nor were they Pinkertons. Their equipment, their methods all spoke of a level of sophistication far beyond what she would expect from private investigators. Reynolds himself supervised the search of the root cellar, spending an inordinate amount of time examining the walls and floor. Sarah held her breath as he passed near the hidden entrance, but if he noticed anything unusual, he gave no indication. The false wall Thomas had designed held it secret, at least for now. By mid-afternoon, the search appeared to be winding down. Reynolds' men had withdrawn to the yard, conferring in low voices as they packed away their equipment. Reynolds himself remained in the house, seated at the kitchen table across from Sarah, his expression unreadable. You have a lovely home, Mrs. Mitchell, he said conversationally. It must have been difficult maintaining it after your husband's passing. Sarah's hands folded on the table before her tightened imperceptibly. We've managed, Reynolds nodded, his gaze wandering around the kitchen before settling back on her face. Captain Thomas Mitchell, a brilliant man by all accounts. His work during the war was revolutionary. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered in her chest. My husband rarely spoke of his war service, Colonel. He preferred to focus on the future rather than the past. A commendable attitude, Reynolds agreed, though sometimes the past has a way of resurfacing. He leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Mitchell, I think we both know Silas Maddox didn't come here about land speculation. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Mr. Maddox's motives were his own, Colonel. Whatever he was seeking, it died within him in that explosion. Reynolds studied her for a long moment, then sighed, leaning back in his chair. I was hoping we could avoid this unpleasantness, but I see you're determined to maintain this charade. He called out, his voice suddenly sharp with command. Bring him in. The front door opened, and two of Reynolds' men entered, half carrying, half dragging a third figure between them. Sarah gasped as they deposited Sheriff Wilson onto a chair. The lawman's face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, his normally neat uniform torn and bloody. Frank, Sarah started to rise, but Reynolds' cold voice stopped her. Please remain seated, Mrs. Mitchell. Sheriff Wilson and I have already had a most illuminating conversation. Reynolds nodded to his men, who withdrew to stand guard at the door. He was initially quite resistant, much like yourself, but eventually he saw the wisdom of cooperation. Wilson raised his head with effort, his one good eye finding Sarah's. I'm sorry, he croaked, his voice ragged. They're not Pinkertons, Sarah. They're military, some kind of secret unit. Reynolds smiled thinly. Not so secret now, it seems. He turned back to Sarah. Unit 37, Mrs. Mitchell, a specialized division formed during the war to develop and deploy advanced weaponry. Your husband was one of our chief scientists before his unfortunate crisis of conscience. Sarah's mind raced trying to process this new information. Thomas had never mentioned Unit 37 specifically, but he had spoken of government agencies that had pressured him to weaponize his research. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The same thing Maddox wanted," Reynolds replied frankly. "Project Aegis. The complete project, not the decoy you so cleverly used to eliminate poor Silas." He leaned forward again, his eyes cold. "You see, unlike Maddox, I know Thomas Mitchell would never have destroyed his life's work entirely. He would have preserved it, hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere only he, or perhaps his devoted wife, would know to look." Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral, aware that Reynolds was watching her closely for any reaction. "You're mistaken, Colonel. Whatever my husband created during the war died with him 7 years ago." Reynolds sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. "Mrs. Mitchell, I admire your loyalty, I truly do, but you must understand your position." He gestured toward the window where William could be seen in the yard surrounded by Reynolds' men. "Your son has quite a military bearing. Served in the war himself, didn't he? It would be a shame if he were to be charged with obstruction of a federal investigation. The penalties for such crimes are severe." Sarah's blood ran cold at the thinly veiled threat. "You wouldn't dare. He's done nothing wrong." "Perhaps not," Reynolds conceded. "But in times of national security, certain legal flexibilities are permitted." His smile returned colder than ever. "And then there's your daughter and grandson. Such a bright boy, I understand. It would be tragic if his education were interrupted by, say, the incarceration of his mother and grandmother on charges of conspiracy." Fury surged through Sarah, momentarily overriding her fear. "You're no better than Maddox," she spat, "using threats against innocent people to get what you want." Reynolds' expression hardened. "I am nothing like Maddox, Mrs. Mitchell. He was a traitor, a renegade seeking power for personal gain. I serve my country. Everything I do is in service to that higher purpose." "Including torturing a local sheriff?" Sarah demanded, gesturing toward Wilson's battered form. Reynolds shrugged, unmoved. "Regrettable but necessary, just as what happens next will be." He stood looming over the table. "I'll give you 1 hour to reconsider your position, Mrs. Mitchell. After that, I'll be forced to take more drastic measures, starting with your son." With that, he strode from the kitchen, barking orders to his men as he went. 2 of them remained to guard Sarah and Wilson, their expressions impassive, as they took up positions by the doors. Sarah moved immediately to Wilson's side, examining his injuries with gentle hands. "Frank, I'm so sorry," she murmured, reaching for a cloth to dab at the blood on his face. Wilson winced but managed a weak smile. "Not your fault, Sarah. I should have been more careful." He glanced at the guards, then lowered his voice to a barely audible whisper. "They're planning something big. I overheard them talking. They want to use the weapon to pacify some territory. Didn't catch where." Sarah's hands stilled momentarily as she absorbed this information. If Unit 37 was planning a military operation using Aegis technology, the devastation could be unimaginable. "We can't let them have it, Frank," she whispered back, pretending to adjust his collar as she leaned close. "Thomas buried it for a reason." Wilson nodded slightly, his good eye conveying his understanding. "What are you going to do?" Sarah glanced at the guards who were watching them with bored vigilance, then back at Wilson. "Whatever I have to," she replied softly. For the next half hour, Sarah tended to Wilson's injuries, her mind racing with possible plans, each seeming more desperate than the last. Through the window, she could see Reynolds' men establishing a perimeter around the house, effectively cutting off any possibility of escape. William was now seated on the porch, his hands apparently bound behind him, while Elizabeth and Benjamin were nowhere to be seen. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, just as Sarah had feared. Reynolds was clearly prepared to use her family as leverage to force her compliance, and she had no doubt he would make good on his threats if she continued to resist. The sound of the front door opening drew Sarah's attention. Reynolds entered, followed by 2 men dragging a struggling William between them. Her son's face was bloodied, his expression a mixture of pain and defiance as he was forced into a chair opposite Sarah. "I thought we had an hour," Sarah said, unable to keep the tremor from her voice at the sight of her injured son. Reynolds checked his pocket watch with exaggerated precision. Did I say an hour? How careless of me. He gestured to one of his men, who produced a wicked-looking knife, pressing it against William's throat. Perhaps I can help clarify your options, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she looked from Reynolds to her son. William shook his head minutely, his eyes conveying a clear message. Don't give in. Where are Elizabeth and Benjamin? Sarah demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. Safe for now, Reynolds replied. They're being held in one of our wagons under guard. Their continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. Sarah felt cornered, trapped by impossible choices. Give Reynolds what he wanted and risk unleashing a weapon of mass destruction upon unsuspecting victims. Refuse and watch her family suffer, possibly die, before Reynolds inevitably found the chamber anyway. If I show you, she said slowly, each word an effort, you'll release my family, allow us to leave. Reynolds smiled, the expression of a predator who knows his prey is weakening. Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. I have no personal quarrel with you or your family. Once we have what we came for, you'll be free to go wherever you wish. The lie was transparent, but Sarah had no choice but to pretend to believe it. Very well, she said, her voice hollow with defeat. I'll take you to it. William struggled against his captors. Mother, no, you can't. The guard's knife pressed harder, drawing a thin line of blood that silenced William's protest. Sarah rose from her chair, her legs unsteady beneath her. Please don't hurt him further. I'll cooperate. Reynolds nodded to his men, who relaxed their hold on William slightly, though the knife remained at his throat. A wise decision, Mrs. Mitchell. Now where is it? Sarah gestured toward the pantry. There's a trap door to the root cellar. Behind a false wall in the cellar is a second underground chamber. That's where Thomas hid the real Project Aegis. Reynolds' eyes gleamed with triumph as he gestured for his men to proceed. After you, Mrs. Mitchell. With heavy steps, Sarah led the way to the pantry. Her mind continued to race, searching for a way out of this trap, even as she moved inexorably toward revealing Thomas's greatest secret. She lifted the trap door to the root cellar, the familiar wooden steps creaking under her weight as she descended, followed closely by Reynolds and two of his men, with William being forced down behind them. The root cellar was cool and dim, lined with shelves containing preserved foods and supplies. Sarah moved to the far wall, a seemingly solid barrier of stone and mortar. With resigned movements, she pressed a specific sequence of stones, each one shifting slightly under her touch. A soft click echoed in the silence, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Reynolds let out a soft sound of satisfaction, pushing past Sarah to peer into the darkness. Extraordinary, he murmured. Mitchell was even more ingenious than I gave him credit for. Sarah remained silent, watching as Reynolds instructed one of his men to fetch lanterns. Within minutes, the passage was illuminated, revealing a steel-lined corridor that sloped gently downward, disappearing into darkness. After you, Mrs. Mitchell, Reynolds said, gesturing for her to proceed. And do be careful. I would hate for any accidents to befall you before you've served your purpose. With William still held at knife point behind her, Sarah had no choice but to comply. She stepped into the passage, the temperature dropping noticeably as they moved deeper underground. Unlike the chamber beneath the barn, this passage was immaculately maintained, the air fresh due to the ventilation system Thomas had ingeniously designed. After approximately 50 feet, the passage opened into a large chamber, its walls lined with the same steel plating as the corridor. Unlike the decoy chamber, this one contained no workbenches, no scattered equipment. At its center stood a single pedestal, upon which rested a device roughly the size of a small crate, its surface inscribed with the same intricate patterns that had adorned the decoy. Reynolds brushed past Sarah, approaching the pedestal with an expression of near reverence. Project Aegis, he breathed, extending a hand toward the device. At last. Don't touch it, Sarah warned sharply. The device is calibrated to respond only to specific energy signatures. The wrong approach could trigger a defensive mechanism. Reynolds withdrew his hand, turning to Sarah with narrowed eyes. Then you will show me how to safely transport it. Sarah approached the pedestal slowly, her mind still desperately seeking a solution. The device before them was indeed dangerous, but not in the way Reynolds believed. Thomas had built this chamber not to house the actual Aegis technology, but as a last-ditch fail-safe, a self-destruct mechanism designed to eliminate any trace of his work should it fall into the wrong hands. But revealing that now would only endanger William further. She needed time, a distraction, any opening that might allow them to escape. As she reached the pedestal, a sudden commotion from the passage behind them drew everyone's attention. Shouts echoed down the corridor, followed by the sound of gunfire. Reynolds cursed, drawing his sidearm as he barked orders to his men. "Secure the device, I'll deal with this interruption." As Reynolds hurried back toward the passage, the guard holding William momentarily loosened his grip. It was the opening William had been waiting for. With a swift, violent movement, he drove his head backward, connecting with his captor's face with a sickening crunch. The knife clattered to the floor as the man reeled backward, blood streaming from his shattered nose. William dove for the weapon, his bound hands hampering him, but not preventing him from scooping up the knife. The second guard, momentarily frozen in surprise, recovered too late as William lunged upward, driving the blade into the man's thigh. The guard howled in pain, collapsing as William scrambled to his feet. "Mother, run!" William shouted awkwardly, sawing at his bindings with the bloody knife. Sarah hesitated only a moment before sprinting toward the passage. But Reynolds had already returned, his face contorted with fury as he leveled his revolver at her. "Enough!" he roared. "The next person who moves dies where they stand." The chamber fell silent except for the pained groans of the injured guard. Reynolds' gaze darted between Sarah and William, his weapon steady in his hand. "Now," he said, his voice deadly calm, "you will both return to the house. My men have subdued whatever pathetic rescue attempt your allies mounted, and my patience is at an end." With grim resignation, Sarah and William allowed themselves to be marched back up the passage and through the root cellar. As they emerged into the kitchen, Sarah gasped at the scene before her. Sheriff Wilson lay on the floor, a fresh wound bleeding profusely from his shoulder. Beside him, bound and kneeling, were Elizabeth and Benjamin, the boy's face streaked with tears, though he remained stoically silent. But it was the third figure, held between two of Reynolds' men, that caused Sarah's heart to nearly stop in her chest. A gaunt man with wild, unkempt hair and a beard streaked with gray. His body thin to the point of emaciation, his clothes little more than rags. But his eyes, those eyes she would have recognized anywhere despite the haunted emptiness that now filled them. "Thomas," she whispered, the name escaping of her lips like a prayer. Her husband, supposedly dead for 7 years, raised his head at the sound of her voice. Recognition flickered in his gaze, followed by an expression of such profound sorrow that Sarah felt her knees weaken beneath her. "Sarah," he croaked, his voice a broken shadow of the strong, confident tone she remembered. "I'm so sorry." Reynolds smiled coldly, clearly savoring the shock his revelation had caused. "Touching, isn't it? The family reunion you never thought possible." He gestured for his men to force Thomas into a chair. "Captain Mitchell has been our guest for the past 7 years, Mrs. Mitchell. A reluctant guest, I admit, but a valuable one nonetheless." Sarah stared at her husband, unable to process the reality of his presence. How she managed the single word encompassing a universe of questions. The accident that supposedly claimed your husband's life was, shall we say, staged? Reynolds explained, holstering his weapon now that his men had the situation under control. "We couldn't allow his brilliance to go to waste, not when the nation's security was at stake. So we recruited him back into service." "You imprisoned him," Sarah corrected, fury rising through her shock. "Tortured him by the looks of it." Reynolds shrugged, unmoved by her accusation. "Captain Mitchell proved resistant to our persuasion, but he did eventually provide valuable insights, though never the full extent of his knowledge regarding Project Aegis." He moved to stand behind Thomas, placing a hand on his shoulder that made the gaunt man flinch. He maintained quite stubbornly that the technology had been destroyed. "I never believed him, of course, but without proof." Thomas raised his head, again his eyes finding Sarah's. "I didn't tell them," he whispered. "Not about the chamber, not about the fail-safe." Reynolds' grip on Thomas's shoulder tightened painfully. "But now we have both, don't we? The technology and the man who created it. Together at last." Sarah looked around at her family. William still bleeding from the struggle in the chamber. Elizabeth and Benjamin bound and terrified. Frank Wilson barely conscious on the floor. And Thomas, the husband she had mourned for 7 years, now returned to her as a broken shadow of himself. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, the impossible choice she faced. Reynolds would never let them go, not now that they knew Thomas was alive, not now that they had seen the true face of Unit 37. If she helped them secure Aegis, countless innocent lives might be lost to whatever pacification the unit was planning. If she refused, her family would suffer, perhaps die, and Reynolds would likely obtain the technology anyway. But Thomas's words echoed in her mind. The fail-safe. The self-destruct mechanism built into the chamber, designed to erase all trace of Project Aegis should it fall into the wrong hands. A mechanism that only she and Thomas knew how to activate. Thomas seemed to read her thoughts, a flicker of the old connection between them, momentarily bridging the years of separation. He gave her the barest nod, an almost imperceptible movement that Reynolds standing behind him couldn't see. Sarah straightened, decision made. Whatever happened next, she would not allow Thomas's creation to be used for destruction. Not again. Not ever. Colonel Reynolds, she said, her voice stronger now, infused with newfound resolve. I will help you transport the device safely, but only under certain conditions. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, amused by her apparent audacity. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Mrs. Mitchell. On the contrary, Sarah countered, the device is calibrated to respond to specific energy signatures as I mentioned. Without proper handling, it will self-destruct if moved more than 20 feet from its current position. You need me to disable that feature. Reynolds studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the truthfulness of her claim. Finally, he nodded. Very well. What are your conditions? My family goes free, all of them including Thomas and Sheriff Wilson. You provide medical attention for the wounded, then leave them in peace. Sarah met Reynolds' gaze steadily. In return, I will accompany you with the device, show you how to control it, and explain its operation in full. Mother, no, Elizabeth protested, struggling against her bonds. Reynolds silenced her with a sharp gesture. An interesting proposal, Mrs. Mitchell. But what guarantee do I have that you'll cooperate once your family is safe? You'll have me? Thomas spoke up, his voice stronger than before. I'll come with you voluntarily. Sarah and I will show you how to use Aegis, but only after our family is free. Reynolds looked between the two of them, calculation evident in his expression. The two architects of Project Aegis working together again. A tempting offer. He paced the kitchen, considering. But I think not. Not quite as proposed, at least. He stopped, turning to face them with a cold smile. Here is my counteroffer. Mrs. Mitchell and Captain Mitchell will accompany me to the chamber now and prepare the device for transport. Once that is complete, I will release Elizabeth Benjamin and Sheriff Wilson. He glanced at William. Your son, however, will remain with us as insurance of your continued cooperation. Once we reach our destination and the device is successfully installed, he will be released unharmed. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas spoke first. We accept, he said firmly, ignoring Sarah's startled look. But we'll need privacy in the chamber to deactivate the security protocols. They're delicate. Reynolds considered this, then nodded. Very well. But be aware, Captain Mitchell, that your son's life depends on your success. Any attempt at deception, any accidents with the device, and he dies. Painfully. Thomas nodded grimly. I understand. Reynolds gestured to his men. Secure the prisoners. Johnson Davies, you'll accompany me to the chamber with the Mitchells. As the soldiers moved to obey, Sarah managed to catch Thomas's eye again. A silent message passed between them, decades of marriage, allowing communication without words. Whatever happened in that chamber, they would face it together, and somehow they would find a way to save their family and prevent Project Aegis from falling into Reynolds' hands, even if it cost them their lives. Reynolds led them back to the root cellar, down the passage, and into the underground chamber, where the Aegis device waited on its pedestal. He stationed his men at the entrance to the chamber, then gestured for Sarah and Thomas to proceed. You have 5 minutes, he said coldly. Make them count. As they approached the pedestal, Thomas took Sarah's hand, his touch painfully familiar, despite the years of separation. His fingers were skeletal, the skin rough and covered with scars that spoke of unspeakable treatment. Sarah, he whispered, his voice for her ears alone. I never thought I'd see you again. She squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. I mourned you. All these years. I know. His eyes, though haunted, held a spark of the man she had known. Every day the thought of you, of our children, kept me alive, kept me from giving them what they wanted. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, ensuring Reynolds couldn't overhear. The fail-safe, she murmured. Can we activate it without them knowing? Thomas nodded minutely. The sequence is embedded in the control panel. But Sarah, he hesitated, pain crossing his features. Once initiated, we have only minutes to clear the area. The reaction is substantial. Sarah understood the implication immediately. William, the others. We can't leave them. No, Thomas agreed, which is why I need to create a distraction, something that will force Reynolds to evacuate everyone from the house. Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. What are you planning? Before Thomas could answer, Reynolds' impatient voice cut through their whispered conference. Time is running short, Captain. I suggest you focus on the task at hand. Thomas released Sarah's hand, turning to the pedestal with a professional demeanor that momentarily transformed him from the broken prisoner to the brilliant scientist she had married. The device requires a specific sequence to deactivate its security protocols, he explained loudly enough for Reynolds to hear. Without this sequence, any attempt to move it will trigger a defensive mechanism. Reynolds approached, watching closely as Thomas began manipulating controls hidden within the intricate designs on the device's surface. Proceed, he ordered. Thomas worked methodically, his scarred hands moving with surprising dexterity over the device. Sarah stood beside him, following his movements with growing understanding. He wasn't deactivating the security protocols, he was activating the fail-safe, but in a manner that wouldn't be immediately apparent. Colonel, Thomas said, suddenly his voice tense. There's a problem. Reynolds stepped closer, suspicious. What kind of problem? The power core is showing signs of instability. See these readings? Thomas pointed to a small display panel that had illuminated on the device's surface. The containment field is fluctuating. Reynolds leaned in, studying the display with a frown. What does that mean? It means, Thomas said gravely, that unless we stabilize the core immediately, we risk a catastrophic energy release, similar to what happened at Sharpsburg, but potentially much worse. Fear flickered across Reynolds' face before he masked it with professional concern. How long do we have? Thomas glanced at the display again. Hard to say, minutes perhaps, but we'll need specialized equipment from the house to stabilize it. Reynolds hesitated, clearly torn between suspicion and self-preservation. What kind of equipment? Electromagnetic dampeners, Thomas replied without hesitation. I built them years ago as a precaution. They are hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards in my old study. Sarah can show your men where to find them. Reynolds studied Thomas for a long moment, then nodded to one of his men. Davies, go with Mrs. Mitchell. Retrieve these dampeners. He fixed Sarah with a cold stare. No tricks, Mrs. Mitchell. Remember what's at stake. Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral, despite the turmoil within. As she moved toward the passage with Davies close behind, she caught Thomas's eye one last time. Whatever he was planning, whatever desperate gambit he had set in motion, she needed to be ready. The fate of their family and perhaps many more depended on it. As Sarah led Davies back through the root cellar and up into the house, her mind raced, trying to interpret Thomas's plan. There were no electromagnetic dampeners hidden in his study. The very concept was nonsensical in the context of Aegis technology. Whatever Thomas had activated in the chamber was likely already counting down to some catastrophic event, one that would destroy the device and potentially much more. She needed to get her family clear of the house, and quickly. Davies followed her into Thomas's study, his weapon trained on her back as she moved to the desk. Where are these dampeners? He demanded. Sarah knelt, pretending to examine the floorboards while actually studying the room, seeking any advantage. Beneath this section, she replied, indicating a spot near the bookshelves. Help me move the rug. As Davies leaned down to grasp the corner of the rug, Sarah saw her opening. With a swift, decisive movement, she grabbed the heavy brass paperweight from Thomas's desk and brought it down on Davies' exposed head with all her strength. The man crumpled, without a sound, blood immediately welling from the wound. Sarah checked his pulse, still alive but unconscious. Good. She had no desire to kill even one of Reynolds' men. Moving quickly, she retrieved Davies' revolver, then made her way to the kitchen where her family was being held. She peered cautiously through the doorway, assessing the situation. Elizabeth and Benjamin remained bound, guarded by a single soldier, while William sat slumped in a chair, his hands still tied behind him. Sheriff Wilson lay where she had last seen him, seemingly unconscious, his wounds still bleeding sluggishly. The guard paced near the window, his back momentarily to the door. Sarah seized the opportunity, entering silently and raising the revolver. Don't move, she commanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Drop your weapon or die where you stand. The guard froze, then slowly turned, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation as he evaluated his options. His hand twitched toward his holstered gun. I wouldn't, Sarah warned, cocking the hammer of her revolver. I'm an excellent shot, and at this distance, I won't miss. Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, perhaps convinced the man. He carefully removed his weapon and placed it on the floor. Kick it toward me, Sarah instructed. When he complied, she addressed Elizabeth without taking her eyes off the guard. Lizzie, can you free yourself? Elizabeth twisted in her bonds. Afusana. I think so. The knots are loose. They were in a hurry. Good. Free Benjamin, then William. Sarah gestured with the revolver for the guard to move away from her family. You on your knees, hands behind your head. As Elizabeth worked to untie Benjamin, Sarah explained urgently, we need to leave now. Your father has activated some kind of failsafe in the chamber. I don't know exactly what it will do, but I suspect it's designed to destroy all evidence of his work. William, whom Elizabeth was now freeing, looked up sharply. And Father Reynolds. Still in the chamber, Sarah confirmed grimly. I don't think your father intends to leave. Elizabeth gasped. But it means we need to hurry. Sarah cut her off, unwilling to voice the terrible conclusion she had already reached. Thomas was sacrificing himself to ensure Reynolds never obtained Aegis to ensure their family's safety. It was a decision she understood all too well, even as it tore at her heart. Once William was free, he immediately moved to check on Sheriff Wilson. He's alive, but barely, he reported. We need to get him medical attention. Sarah nodded. Help me secure this one first, she said, indicating the kneeling guard. Then we'll take Wilson and get as far from the house as possible. Using the guard's own belt and bandana, they bound and gagged him swiftly. William retrieved the man's revolver, checking that it was loaded before tucking it into his waistband. What about the others, Reynolds' men outside? Elizabeth asked as she helped Benjamin gather a few essential supplies. We'll have to deal with them as we go, Sarah replied. Our priority is getting clear of whatever's about to happen in that chamber. William lifted Wilson as gently as possible, draping the unconscious sheriff over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Ready? Sarah led the way to the front door, peering out cautiously. Two of Reynolds' men stood near the wagons, while a third patrolled the perimeter of the yard. All were visibly on edge, glancing frequently toward the house as if expecting orders. We'll head for the back door, Sarah decided, retreating from the window. Through the orchard to the creek. If we can reach the woods beyond, we'll have cover. As they moved through the house toward the rear exit, a low rumble began beneath their feet, the floorboards vibrating slightly. It's starting, Sarah said, urgency infusing her voice. Run, now. They burst through the back door, William in the lead, with Wilson draped over his shoulder, Elizabeth clutching Benjamin's hand as they sprinted across the yard toward the small apple orchard that bordered the eastern edge of the property. Shouts erupted behind them as Reynolds' men spotted their escape. Gunshots followed bullets splintering bark from trees as the family weaved through the orchard. The rumbling intensified, the ground now shaking violently enough to make running difficult. Sarah glanced back, once her heart constricting, at the sight of the farmhouse. Her home for nearly 3 decades, the place where she had raised her children, where she had mourned her supposedly dead husband. A blinding blue-white light suddenly erupted from beneath the house, shooting skyward like a reverse lightning bolt. The air itself seemed to vibrate, a high-pitched whine building to a crescendo that forced them to cover their ears. Down, William shouted, dropping to the ground with Wilson beside him. Sarah threw herself over Benjamin as Elizabeth also hit the dirt, and all of them pressing their faces into the earth as the light intensified, turning the world an impossible brilliant white. The concussive wave hit them a moment later, a wall of force that seemed to compress the very air from their lungs before passing over them. The sound was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Not an explosion, but something more fundamental, as if reality itself was being torn apart and reassembled. When she dared to look up again, the farmhouse was gone. In its place was a perfect hemispherical crater, its edges smooth as glass, extending nearly 100 yards in every direction. Of Reynolds, his men, and the underground chamber, there was no trace. And of Thomas, the husband, she had only just found, again, nothing remained. Sarah stared at the destruction, a strange numbness spreading through her as she helped Benjamin to his feet. The boy was shaking his eyes wide with shock as he looked at the place where his grandparents' home had stood just moments before. Grandmother, he whispered, his voice trembling. Was that what grandfather created? Sarah pulled him close, shielding him from the sight as best she could. No, Benjamin. That was what he created to destroy it, to make sure no one could ever use it to harm others. Elizabeth joined them, dust-coating her hair, and clothes a thin trickle of blood running from a cut on her forehead. "Mother," she said softly. "Father, he knew, didn't he? What would happen?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Thomas had known exactly what the failsafe would do, had known it would claim his life, along with Reynolds and the terrible weapon he had created. His final act of atonement for the destruction his work had once caused. William approached, supporting a semi-conscious Wilson. "We need to keep moving," he said grimly. "That light was visible for miles. There will be others coming to investigate." Sarah took one last look at the crater that had been their home, silently bidding farewell to Thomas for the second time. Then she turned away, straightening her shoulders with resolve. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady despite the grief threatening to overwhelm her. "We keep moving, together." As the Mitchell family made their way toward the distant tree line, Sarah felt the weight of Thomas's sacrifice pressing on her heart. He had given everything to protect them, to ensure his creation would never again be used for destruction. Now it fell to her to honor that sacrifice by keeping their family safe, by finding a way forward from the ashes of what they had lost. The road ahead would not be easy. They were homeless, hunted, with few resources, and a wounded man in need of care. But they were alive, and they were together. In the face of all they had endured, that simple fact seemed like a miracle worthy of gratitude. Sarah Mitchell squared her shoulders and led her family forward, away from the ruins of their past and toward whatever uncertain future awaited them. One step at a time, one day at a time, the only way survival had ever been possible. Behind them, the perfect crater slowly filled with shadows as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Nature would eventually reclaim this scarred earth, just as it reclaimed all human endeavors, given enough time. But the memory of what had happened here, of Thomas Mitchell's final sacrifice, would live on in those who had survived. And perhaps, Sarah thought as she clutched Benjamin's hand tightly in her own, that was the only immortality any of them could hope for. To be remembered, to have their stories carried forward by those they had loved. It would have to be enough. 3 days had passed since the destruction of the Mitchell farm. 3 days of desperate flight through the Montana wilderness, evading pursuit and struggling to survive with minimal supplies. Sheriff Wilson's condition had deteriorated, despite Elizabeth's best efforts to treat his wounds with the limited medical resources at her disposal. The family had taken shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin nestled deep in a forested valley, 20 miles from the smoking crater that had once been their home. The small, dilapidated structure offered little comfort, but provided essential protection from the elements and prying eyes. Sarah sat on a fallen log outside the cabin, watching the sun's first rays break over the distant mountains. Sleep had become a rare luxury, her mind constantly replaying Thomas's final moments, imagining what he must have felt as he activated the failsafe, knowing it would claim his life. To find him after 7 years of grief, only to lose him again, within hours, the cruelty of it threatened to overwhelm her in quiet moments like this. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her from her thoughts. William emerged from the tree line, a pair of rabbits hanging from his belt, evidence of a successful morning hunt. "Any sign of pursuit?" Sarah asked, her voice rough from exhaustion. William shook his head, setting the rabbits down beside her. "Nothing, but that doesn't mean they're not still looking." Sarah nodded grimly. While Reynolds and his immediate men had been destroyed in the explosion, they both knew Unit 37 wouldn't simply abandon their search. An operation of such scale and secrecy would have resources beyond what they had encountered so far. "How's Sheriff Wilson?" William asked, lowering himself onto the log beside his mother. Sarah's expression tightened with concern. "Elizabeth says the fever's getting worse. Without proper medicine." She didn't finish the thought. They both understood the dire implications. William ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Thomas that it made Sarah's heart ache. "We need to get him to a doctor, and soon." "The nearest town is Bridger Creek," Sarah said. "But that's at least a day's ride, and we have no horses, not to mention the risk of being recognized." Before William could respond, Elizabeth emerged from the cabin, dark circles beneath her eyes testifying to her sleepless night tending to Wilson. "He's awake," she reported, wiping her hands on her already soiled apron. "Asking for you, Mother." Sarah rose immediately, following Elizabeth into the cabin's dim interior. Benjamin sat beside Wilson's makeshift bed, dutifully changing the damp cloth on the sheriff's forehead as Elizabeth had taught him. The boy looked up as they entered, his young face solemn beyond his years. He was talking funny, Benjamin reported, about people who aren't here. Delirium, Elizabeth explained quietly, from the infection. Sarah knelt beside the pallet where Wilson lay, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. His eyes fluttered open at her approach, struggling to focus on her face. Sarah, he rasped, his voice barely audible. Need to tell you. Save your strength, Frank, Sarah urged, taking his hand. It burned with fever, despite the coolness of the cabin. Wilson shook his head weakly. No time. Listen. He coughed, the effort clearly causing him pain. Reynolds, not the only one. Others coming. Sarah leaned closer. Others from Unit 37. Wilson managed a slight nod. Heard them. Talking. Base camp. 5 miles north of Bridger Creek. Another coughing fit seized him. Looking for something else. Thomas's partner. Sarah's blood ran cold. James Harrison, she whispered. Thomas's closest colleague during the war the man Maddox had claimed to have tortured for information about Aegis. Alive. Wilson confirmed, his eyes drifting closed as exhaustion overtook him. Prisoner. Like Thomas was. Sarah sat back on her heels, processing this new information. James Harrison had been Thomas's right hand throughout the development of Project Aegis. If he was still alive, still a prisoner of Unit 37, the implications were staggering. The explosion might have destroyed the prototype in the original plans, but with Harrison's knowledge, the unit might still be able to recreate the technology. Elizabeth, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. Mother, what does this mean? Sarah rose slowly, her decision already forming. It means our ordeal isn't over. If Harrison is alive, if they're holding him somewhere near Bridger Creek, then Project Aegis isn't truly destroyed. William had joined them, his expression grim as he absorbed the conversation. So what do? We can barely take care of ourselves, let alone mount a rescue mission against a military unit. Sarah looked at each member of her family in turn. William battle-hardened but exhausted. Elizabeth strong yet stretched to her limits, caring for Wilson. Benjamin too young to face such danger yet showing resilience that filled her with both pride and sorrow. First we get Frank to a doctor, she decided. We have no choice. Without medical attention, he won't survive another day. And then, Elizabeth prompted. Sarah's expression hardened with resolve. Then we find James Harrison. We finish what Thomas started, ensuring Project Aegis can never be recreated. William shook his head in disbelief. Mother, that's suicide. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and they're looking for us. Perhaps, Sarah acknowledged. But we also have advantages they don't. We know what we're looking for. We understand the technology better than they do. And most importantly, her voice softened, we're fighting for the right reasons. The family fell silent, the weight of Sarah's words settling over them. The path forward was fraught with danger, yet the alternative, allowing Unit 37 to potentially recreate Thomas's weapon, was unthinkable. I'll go to Bridger Creek, William finally said. Alone. I can move faster that way, and if I'm captured, the rest of you will still be free. Sarah started to protest, but William continued, his voice firm. I'll find a doctor and bring him back here for Frank. While I'm there, I can gather information about Unit 37's operations without drawing attention. After a moment's consideration, Sarah nodded reluctantly. Be careful. Use Thomas's name only if absolutely necessary. We don't know who might be listening for it. As William prepared for the journey gathering, what meager supplies they could spare, Sarah pulled him aside for a private word. If anything happens, she said quietly, pressing Thomas's journal into his hands, if you're captured or worse, destroy this. It contains enough information about Aegis that in the wrong hands. I understand, so William interrupted, tucking the journal securely inside his shirt. I won't let it fall into their possession. Sarah embraced her son, holding him tightly, as if she could somehow protect him through sheer force of will. Return to us, she whispered. No matter what you discover, promise me you'll return. William nodded against her shoulder. I promise. They watched him leave at midday, a solitary figure disappearing into the dense forest. The hours that followed passed with excruciating slowness, each family member occupied with tasks that did little to distract from their worry. Elizabeth continued tending to Wilson, whose condition worsened as the day progressed. Benjamin busied himself collecting firewood and fresh water, his normally curious nature subdued by their circumstances. Sarah alternated between helping Elizabeth and keeping watch from a vantage point near the cabin, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding wilderness for any sign of threat. As darkness fell, Sarah lit a single candle, its feeble light casting long shadows across the cabin's interior. They ate a meager supper of rabbit stew, saving a portion for William's return. The night stretched endlessly, the silence broken only by Wilson's labored breathing and the occasional distant howl of a wolf. Dawn came with no sign of William. Sarah tried to quell her rising anxiety, reminding herself that the journey to Bridger Creek and back would take at minimum a full day, likely longer if William needed to move cautiously. By midday, Wilson had slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and irregular. Elizabeth sat beside him, her face etched with despair as she bathed his burning forehead. "We're losing him," she said softly when Sarah approached. "Without medicine, without proper care." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've done everything possible, Lizzie, more than most trained doctors could manage under these conditions." Elizabeth leaned into her mother's touch, exhaustion momentarily overwhelming her. "I keep thinking about Father," she confessed. "How he chose to pray rather than let his creation fall into the wrong hands. I wonder if I would have that kind of courage." "You already show that courage every day," Sarah assured her. "Caring for others, protecting Benjamin, surviving despite everything we've lost." A sudden noise outside the cabin froze them both. Sarah was on her feet instantly, moving silently to retrieve the revolver she kept within reach. She gestured for Elizabeth to stay with Wilson as she crept toward the door, weapon raised. The sound came again, a deliberate rustling, too controlled to be wildlife. Sarah positioned herself beside the door, back pressed against the rough-hewn logs, and waited. "Mother," William's voice called softly. "It's me." Relief flooded through Sarah, though she maintained her caution. "Are you alone?" "Yes," came the reply. "But I've brought help." Sarah opened the door carefully, revolver still ready. William stood there, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, accompanied by an older man carrying a medical bag. "Dr. Elliot," William introduced him, "from Bridger Creek. He's agreed to help." Sarah lowered the weapon, studying the doctor warily. He was perhaps 60, with a neatly trimmed white beard and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "At what price?" she asked directly. Dr. Elliot shook his head. "No price, Mrs. Mitchell. Your son saved my grandson from drowning last year during the spring floods. I never forgot that debt." He gestured to his bag. "Now where is my patient?" Sarah stepped aside, allowing them to enter. As the doctor moved immediately to Wilson's side, William drew his mother away for a private conversation. "Bridger Creek is crawling with soldiers," he reported in a hushed voice. "Not in uniform, but unmistakable in their bearing. They're questioning everyone, showing sketches of our faces." Sarah's heart sank. "In the base camp Wilson mentioned." "It exists," William confirmed. 5 miles north, just as he said. Heavy security. I couldn't get close, but from what I gathered in town, they're holding several persons of interest there for questioning." "Harrison," Sarah breathed. William nodded grimly. "Almost certainly, but Mother, there's more." He hesitated, glancing toward Elizabeth and Benjamin to ensure they couldn't overhear. "There are rumors in town about strange lights in the sky near the camp. Blue-white lights, like what we saw when—" He didn't need to finish. Sarah understood immediately. "They're testing something. A recreation of Aegis technology." "Or at least attempting to," William agreed, "which means they must have extracted some information from Harrison already." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, the implications washing over her like ice water. "How long do we have?" William shook his head. "Days at most. From what I overheard, they're planning to move the operation soon. Something about a field demonstration for military officials." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Elliot approached them, wiping his hands on a cloth. His expression was grave. "The bullet wound itself isn't fatal," he reported, "but the infection has spread throughout his system. I've cleaned the wound and given him a dose of morphine for the pain, but—" He shook his head regretfully. "Without proper hospital care, his chances are poor." "Can he be moved?" Sarah asked. The doctor considered. "Not easily and not without risk, but leaving him here—" He didn't need to complete the thought. Sarah exchanged looks with William, a silent communication passing between them. "Doctor," she said finally, "would you be willing to take Sheriff Wilson to your home in Bridger Creek, care for him there?" Dr. Elliot's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. I could, yes, but what about the rest of you? The town isn't safe for you right now. We have unfinished business elsewhere, Sarah replied simply. Knowing Frank is in good hands would allow us to address it without distraction. After a moment's hesitation, the doctor nodded. I brought a wagon with a false bottom. It's how I plan to transport you all safely if needed. I can conceal him there for the journey back. Thank you, Sarah said with genuine gratitude. We won't forget your kindness. As William and Dr. Elliot prepared to transfer Wilson to the wagon, Sarah gathered Elizabeth and Benjamin for a family council. She explained what William had discovered and the decision they now faced. We have three options, she concluded. We can flee, try to disappear somewhere they won't find us. We can surrender hope for mercy that likely won't come. Or we can act, try to rescue James Harrison and ensure Project Aegis dies with him. Elizabeth, who had been listening with growing dismay, shook her head. Mother, this is madness. We're talking about infiltrating a military installation with nothing but 2 revolvers and desperation. Not quite nothing, Sarah corrected, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a small object, a metallic disc engraved with the same intricate patterns that had adorned the Aegis device. Your father gave me this years ago, a key of sorts. It generates the same energy signature as the core of Project Aegis. William stared at the disc in disbelief. All this time, you've had a piece of the technology with you. Not a weapon, Sarah clarified, a safeguard. Thomas designed it to disrupt any attempt to recreate the core, a fail-safe beyond the fail-safe. And you think this can help us get to Harrison? Elizabeth asked skeptically. Sarah nodded. If they're experimenting with Aegis technology, this will create a distraction at minimum. At best, it might temporarily disable whatever prototypes they're developing. Benjamin, who had been listening intently, spoke up. I want to help, he declared, his young voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Grandfather gave his life to keep his invention safe. I want to honor that. Elizabeth immediately protested. Absolutely not. You're 10 years old, Benjamin. This isn't your fight. It became his fight the moment Reynolds dragged us into it, Sarah said gently. But your mother's right, Benjamin. What we're planning is too dangerous. The boy's expression fell, but he nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic if not agreeing with it. So what's the plan? William asked, returning from helping the doctor prepare the wagon. Sarah took a deep breath. Dr. Elliot takes Wilson to Bridger Creek tonight. Tomorrow at dawn, the 3 of us approach the camp from different directions. She began sketching a rough map in the dirt floor of the cabin. William from the east, Elizabeth from the west, and myself from the north. Multiple approaches increase our chances of at least one of us reaching Harrison. Elizabeth frowned. And Benjamin, Elliot has agreed to keep him safe at his home until this is resolved one way or another, Sarah replied, avoiding her grandson's disappointed gaze. As the details of the plan took shape, Sarah found herself thinking of Thomas, his brilliance, his compassion, his ultimate sacrifice. She was not naive enough to believe they all would survive the coming confrontation. But if they could prevent his greatest fear from materializing, his creation being used to harm innocents, perhaps that would be enough. The remainder of the day passed in careful preparation. They inventoried their meager weapons and supplies, memorized the approaches to the camp based on William's observations, and prepared for various contingencies. Benjamin remained subdued, clearly unhappy about being left behind, but understanding the necessity. As dusk approached, they bid farewell to Sheriff Wilson, still unconscious, as Dr. Elliot carefully positioned him in the hidden compartment of his wagon. The doctor also reluctantly took charge of Benjamin, the boy's solemn face peering back at his family as the wagon pulled away. I'll take care of him as if he were my own, Dr. Elliot promised. Good luck to you all. The night that followed was tense with anticipation. None of them slept much, each lost in private thoughts and fears. Sarah found herself outside again as dawn approached, watching the eastern sky gradually lighten. Thomas, she whispered to the cool morning air, guide us today. Help us finish what you started. William and Elizabeth joined her as the first rays of sunlight crested the horizon. No words were necessary as they embraced each, understanding this might be their final moment together. Remember, Sarah said as they prepared to separate, our priority is Harrison. If any of us finds him, the signal is 3 shots fired in rapid succession. If you're compromised, a single shot signals the others to abort and retreat. With final nods of acknowledgement, they parted ways, each taking their designated approach toward the Unit 37 camp. Sarah moved north through the dense forest years of rural life, having taught her to walk silently despite the carpet of leaves and twigs. The disc Thomas had given her felt warm against her palm, almost alive with potential energy. After nearly an hour of careful progress, she caught her first glimpse of the camp through the trees, a collection of large canvas tents surrounding a central wooden structure that resembled a hastily constructed laboratory. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements disciplined and alert. Sarah crouched behind a fallen tree, studying the layout and security patterns. The laboratory would be her target, the most likely location for both Harrison and any Aegis prototypes. She was preparing to move closer when a commotion erupted at the eastern edge of the camp. Shouts followed by the sharp report of gunfire drew the attention of most guards. Sarah's heart clenched William's position. Had he been discovered? Using the distraction, she darted forward, keeping low as she moved from cover to cover. The disc pulsed warmly in her hand, its energy signature strengthening as she approached the laboratory building. Sarah reached the structure's rear wall, undetected, pressing herself against it as she sought an entrance. A small window approximately shoulder height offered the only possibility. Using the butt of her revolver, she carefully broke the glass, then reached through to unlatch it. The interior was dimly lit, filled with complex equipment reminiscent of Thomas's workshop. Tables covered in diagrams and components, glass tubing and electrical apparatus she couldn't identify. But what caught her attention immediately was the figure slumped in a chair at the center of the room, a man thin to the point of emaciation, his wrists shackled to the chair arms. "James," she whispered, recognizing Thomas's colleague, despite the years and evident mistreatment. Harrison's head lifted slightly, his eyes struggling to focus on her. Recognition dawned slowly. "Sarah," he rasped. "Sarah Mitchell." She moved quickly to his side, examining his shackles. They were secured with conventional locks, rather than the advanced mechanisms she had feared. Using a hairpin extracted from her bun, she began working on them immediately. "We need to get you out of here," she murmured, glancing anxiously toward the laboratory door. "William and Elizabeth are creating diversions, but we don't have much time." Harrison shook his head weakly. "Too late," he whispered. "They've already built it, a working prototype." Sarah's hand stilled momentarily, where Harrison nodded toward a steel door at the far end of the laboratory. "Containment chamber. They're preparing for a demonstration today. Military officials arriving at noon." With renewed urgency, Sarah returned to picking the locks. The first shackle clicked open, freeing Harrison's right hand. He immediately rubbed his wrist, wincing at the pain of restored circulation. "Thomas?" he asked, his voice hopeful despite his condition. Sarah's expression told him everything. He activated the fail-safe, destroyed the original device and Reynolds with it. Harrison closed his eyes briefly, grief passing over his gaunt features. He always said he would rather die than let Aegis be weaponized again. A bitter smile touched his lips. "I should have been so brave." "You survived," Sarah countered, working on the second shackle. "That took courage, too." The lock finally yielded, freeing Harrison completely. He stood unsteadily, leaning on Sarah for support. "We need to destroy the prototype," he said urgently. "It's unstable, more dangerous than the original. They've rushed the development, ignored critical safety protocols." Sarah withdrew the disc from her pocket, showing it to Harrison. "Thomas gave me this. He said it could disrupt the core." Harrison's eyes widened in recognition. "The harmonic disruptor. Yes, it might work, but..." And he hesitated. "At this stage of development, disrupting the prototype could trigger a cascade reaction. The resulting explosion would be..." He trailed off, the implication clear. "How large?" Sarah asked directly. Harrison's expression was grave. "Miles, and unpredictable. The energy release could expand beyond any containment." Before Sarah could respond, the laboratory door burst open. Two guards entered, weapons raised, followed by a figure that caused Sarah's blood to run cold, a man in an immaculate uniform adorned with the insignia of a general. "Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted her, his cultured voice at odds with the coldness in his eyes. "How kind of you to join us. We've been hoping you might visit." Sarah raised her revolver, aiming at the general's chest. "Stay back." The general seemed unperturbed by the threat. "I am General Harlan Davis, Mrs. Mitchell, Director of Special Weapons Division and Overseer of Unit 37. He gestured casually, and the guards advanced despite Sarah's weapon. "I believe you've already met Dr. Harrison, our chief scientist." Prisoner, Sarah corrected sharply. Victim. Davis smiled thinly. Perspective is such a subjective thing, isn't it? One might equally say Dr. Harrison has been a valued contributor to a project of national importance. Harrison straightened despite his weakness, facing Davis with unexpected defiance. You perverted everything Thomas and I created. Aegis was meant to shield, to protect, not to destroy indiscriminately. A shield is merely a weapon used defensively, Dr. Davis replied dismissively. We've simply expanded its potential. He turned his attention back to Sarah. Now, Mrs. Mitchell, I must ask you to surrender your weapon and that interesting device you're holding. My men have already apprehended your son and daughter. Their continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. Sarah's heart sank at the confirmation of William and Elizabeth's capture, but she maintained her aim. You're lying. I haven't heard the signal. Davis raised an eyebrow. Signal, you mean this? He withdrew a revolver from his coat and fired 3 shots in rapid succession into the ceiling. The sound echoed through the laboratory, a perfect mimicry of the signal they had agreed upon. Sarah felt a wave of despair threaten to overwhelm her, but she forced it back, focusing on the immediate threat. Where are they? She demanded. I want to see them. In due time, Davis assured her. First, I must insist you surrender that disruptor. It's far too valuable to risk damaging. Sarah glanced at Harrison, a silent question in her eyes. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, confirming her suspicion. Davis understood the disk's function, which meant he also understood the threat it posed to the prototype. Very well, she said slowly, lowering her revolver, but I want your assurance that my family will be unharmed. Davis smiled again, the expression never reaching his eyes. You have my word as an officer and a gentleman. Sarah almost laughed at the hollow promise, too reminiscent of Maddox's similar assurance. Instead, she carefully placed her revolver on a nearby table and extended the disc toward Davis. As the general reached for it, Sarah activated the mechanism Thomas had shown her years ago, a specific pressure sequence along the disc's edge. The device hummed to life, emitting a soft blue glow that rapidly intensified. Davis recoiled, recognition and alarm flashing across his face. Stop, that frequency will destabilize the prototype, Sarah finished for him. Yes, I know. A low rumble began beneath their feet, the equipment in the laboratory vibrating with increasing intensity. Harrison gripped Sarah's arm. We need to leave now. The reaction has begun. Davis was already shouting orders, his composure shattered as alarms began blaring throughout the camp. The guards abandoned their posts, fleeing toward the exit. My children, Sarah insisted, grabbing Harrison's arm. We can't leave without them. Harrison nodded grimly. The detention tent. East side of the camp. But Sarah, we have minutes at most before the cascade becomes irreversible. They hurried from the laboratory into chaos. Personnel were running in all directions, abandoning equipment and protocol in their panic. The disc in Sarah's hand pulsed with increasing energy, its blue glow now bright enough to cast shadows even in daylight. Sarah and Harrison made their way toward the eastern perimeter, the scientist struggling to keep pace despite his determination. They reached a large tent guarded by a single soldier who was clearly torn between his duty and self-preservation. The prisoners, Sarah demanded, brandishing the glowing disc. Release them now. The guard's eyes fixed on the disc, widening with recognition and fear. Without a word, he unlocked the tent flap and fled. Inside, William and Elizabeth sat bound to metal chairs, both bearing evidence of rough handling, but otherwise intact. Sarah rushed to them, quickly cutting their bonds with a knife she had concealed in her boot. Mother! William gasped, embracing her briefly before helping Elizabeth to her feet. We heard the alarms. What's happening? The prototype is destabilizing, Harrison explained urgently. The harmonic disruptor has triggered a cascade reaction that will continue to grow until it consumes everything within miles. Elizabeth stared at the scientist, then at the glowing disc in Sarah's hand. Can it be stopped? Harrison shook his head. Not at this stage. Our only hope is to get as far away as possible before detonation. They exited the tent to find the camp largely deserted, most personnel having fled at the first sign of catastrophic failure. The ground trembled continuously now, equipment toppling as the vibrations intensified. This way, William urged, taking the lead as they hurried toward the forest. There are horses at the perimeter guard post. They had nearly reached the tree line when a shot rang out behind them. Harrison stumbled, crying out as he fell to his knees, blood blossoming across his shoulder. Sarah turned to see General Davis standing 20 yards away, his revolver aimed steadily at them, despite the chaos around him. His uniform was disheveled, his composure finally cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "Mitchell," he shouted, "the disruptor, give it to me. It can still be contained." Sarah helped Harrison to his feet, supporting his weight as William and Elizabeth moved to shield them. "You're lying," she called back. "Harrison already told me once the cascade begins, it can't be stopped." Davis advanced his weapon, unwavering. "Then you've killed us all, you fool woman. Your family, yourself, everyone within 50 miles. His face contorted with rage. "At least give me the chance to try." Sarah looked down at the disc, now pulsing so intensely that it hurt to look at directly. Harrison's voice came weakly in her ear. "He's right about one thing. The reaction can be contained but not stopped." "How?" Sarah demanded, her voice low. Harrison's eyes met hers, filled with the same resolute acceptance she had seen in Thomas's final moments. "Return it to the source, the prototype chamber. The reinforced walls might contain some of the blast." It's the only chance for anyone to survive," Harrison confirmed grimly. Sarah made her decision instantly. "William, take your sister and Dr. Harrison. Get as far away as possible." She pressed Thomas's journal into Elizabeth's hands. "Keep this safe. Make sure Benjamin understands when he's older." William's face paled as he realized her intention. "Mother, no. I'll go. You take Harrison and Elizabeth to safety." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I know the location of the chamber. You don't, and Harrison needs immediate medical attention." She embraced her son fiercely. "Protect them, William. That's your duty now." Before he could protest further, Sarah turned and began running back toward the laboratory, the disc clutched tightly in her hand. Davis shouted something behind her, but his words were lost in the growing rumble that now seemed to come from the very air around them. She reached the laboratory building, now abandoned and in disarray from the strengthening vibrations. Equipment had toppled from tables, glass shattered across the floor. Sarah navigated through the debris to the steel door Harrison had indicated, the containment chamber. It stood partially open, evidently left that way in the personnel's hasty evacuation. Inside, a sight both terrifying and eerily beautiful greeted her. A device similar to, but cruder than the one Thomas had created, pulsed with blinding energy, suspended within a complex framework of metal and glass. The air around it seemed to warp and distort reality itself, bending under the strain of contained power. Sarah approached cautiously, the disc in her hand resonating with the prototype, their energies calling to each other like twin stars. The vibrations had intensified to the point that standing was difficult, the floor buckling beneath her feet. As she reached the center of the chamber, Sarah took one last moment to think of her family, William and Elizabeth, hopefully already fleeing to safety, Benjamin waiting with Dr. Elliot, unknowing of his grandmother's fate. She thought of Thomas, wondered if whatever lay beyond death would reunite them at last. "For you, Thomas," she whispered, raising the disc toward the pulsing prototype. "For all of us." The moment the disc touched the prototype's surface, a blinding flash of blue-white light erupted, enveloping Sarah completely. Time seemed to pause, a moment of perfect stillness amid chaos. In that crystallized instant, Sarah felt Thomas's presence as clearly as if he stood beside her, a sensation of peace, of completion, of a circle finally closing. Then the world exploded into light. Miles away, William, Elizabeth, and Harrison had reached a ridge overlooking the valley where the Unit 37 camp lay. They paused, turning to look back, just as a column of brilliant blue-white energy erupted from the laboratory building, shooting skyward before expanding in a perfect hemisphere of light. The shockwave followed seconds later, a wall of force that flattened trees and scoured the earth as it expanded outward. William pulled Elizabeth and Harrison to the ground, shielding them with his body. As the wave passed over them, the ridge thankfully blocking the worst of its power. When they dared to look again, the valley had been transformed into a crater of glass, smooth and perfect, as if carved by some cosmic hand. Of the camp, the laboratory, and Sarah Mitchell, nothing remained. Elizabeth wept silently, her hand gripping William's with crushing force. Harrison, despite his injury, stared at the destruction with a mixture of horror and grim validation, the final proof that he and Thomas had been right to fear their creation's potential. "She saved us," William said softly, his voice thick with grief and pride. "She saved everyone." As they made their painful journey toward Bridger Creek, toward Benjamin, and whatever uncertain future awaited them, the glass crater behind them caught the sun's rays, reflecting them upward in a spray of prismatic light, a monument more fitting than any marble headstone could ever be. 2 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, a small gathering stood on a hillside overlooking the town of Bridger Creek. Benjamin Cooper, his mother, Elizabeth, his uncle William, and a frail but recovering James Harrison watched as Dr. Elliot completed the simple ceremony. 2 wooden markers had been placed side by side bearing the names of Thomas and Sarah Mitchell. Though neither body had been recovered, the family had needed this closure, this place to come and remember. They were extraordinary people, Harrison said softly as the doctor finished speaking. They changed the world, though the world will never know it. William nodded his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders. They sacrificed everything to protect others. I can think of no greater legacy. Benjamin approached the markers, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers between them. The boy had grown in these few weeks, his childish features already showing signs of the man he would become, a man shaped by loss but also by profound love and sacrifice. Will you tell me about them? He asked Harrison. About their work, about Project Aegis. Harrison exchanged glances with Elizabeth, who nodded her permission. Yes, the scientist promised. When you're ready, I'll tell you everything. The triumphs and the failures, the dreams and the warnings. It's your inheritance, after all. Benjamin looked up at him, his young face solemn. Grandmother said grandfather created Aegis as a shield, not a weapon. That's what I want to understand most, how to build things that protect instead of destroy. Harrison's weathered face softened with unexpected hope. That young Benjamin is the most important lesson of all, and one your grandparents would be proud to have passed on. As they turned to leave, William paused for one last look at the markers, at this small, insufficient tribute to 2 lives that had altered the course of history through unseen sacrifice. The world will never know what they did, he said quietly to Harrison, how they saved countless lives. The scientist placed a hand on William's shoulder. Perhaps that's as it should be. Some knowledge is too dangerous for its time. He glanced at Benjamin, walking ahead with Elizabeth and Dr. Elliot. But perhaps someday when humanity has grown wiser, their work can be rediscovered in a form that truly shields rather than harms. William nodded, finding comfort in the possibility. Until then, we keep their story alive in our family. We remember. We remember, Harrison agreed. The small group made their way down the hillside toward the town and whatever future awaited them. Behind them, the twin markers stood sentinel against the vast Montana sky, silent witnesses to a sacrifice the world would never know, but would forever benefit from. Sarah and Thomas Mitchell had given everything to ensure that their greatest creation and its terrible potential would never threaten the innocent. In doing so, they had left their true legacy not in technology or weapons, but in the hearts and minds of those who carried their story forward. Benjamin looked back, once his young face catching the sunlight. "Goodbye, grandmother," he whispered. "Goodbye, grandfather." And then he turned and continued down the path toward a future that existed only because they had loved him enough to die for it. The wind whispered through the grass, a sound almost like distant voices responding to the boy's farewell. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though 2 figures stood beside the markers, hands clasped, watching their family depart. Then they were gone, leaving only the markers, the wind, and the endless Montana sky.